There is something about the end of an era that makes even the strongest voices grow soft, like wind through ancient curtains. And in the twilight of China's imperial grandeur, there stood one woman, alone, defiant, complicated, whose life stretched across the dying breaths of an empire. Her name was Cixi. She was not born in a palace. She did not carry royal blood. Yet she would come to rule a kingdom more vast than the wildest dreams of Europe's queens. She held the reins of power for nearly 5 decades, through whispers and rebellion, through silk robes and midnight decrees. And still, they called her a tyrant, a concubine, a schemer in shadows. But tonight, dear dreamer, we will not shout her story through the corridors of power. We will whisper it, gently, as if brushing dust from old porcelain. We will slow the clocks and dim the lights and walk, quietly, through the winding courtyards of her memory. Imagine it, peaking in the late 1800s, wrapped in fog and ceremony. The forbidden city stands like a sleeping lion, its gates heavy with silence. Inside, corridors echo with footsteps too soft to name. The scent of sandalwood lingers in the air. And behind a golden screen, a woman sits, listening, calculating, waiting. She was called the Dragon Lady, a puppet master, a monster. But she was also a mother, a widow, a survivor of a court that devoured the gentle and rewarded the ruthless. In her youth, she read poetry by moonlight. In her age, she watched foreign ships darken the horizon. Her hands signed treaties and death warrants with equal calm. Yet she never wore the crown. She ruled from behind it. Some say she saved the empire from collapse. Others say she drained it of hope. But what cannot be denied is this: she lived in a time of impossible change, and she faced it with iron and silk. Hers was an age of steam engines and scrolls, of eunuchs and telegrams, of palace intrigue and gunboat diplomacy. And tonight, as the stars begin their slow vigil above us, we will follow her through each chapter. Not with judgment, but with curiosity. We'll walk with her through gilded halls and lonely gardens. We'll listen to her silence, and the secrets it kept. Because, dear dreamer, Cixi's story is not just about one woman. It's about the last breath of a world that once believed it would never end. A world of ceremony, tradition, and shadows. And a woman who dared to outlive it. So, if you're resting your head tonight, if the day has been long and the night feels kind, come closer. Let your thoughts drift softly like falling plum blossoms. This is a story best told slowly, softly, sleepily. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this bedtime tale. It helps more dreamers like you find their way to gentle sleep. And now, before we dive into today's story, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are right now? Because I know that you, me, and everyone else tuned into this video, we all share the same little habit, even if we're scattered across the world, far from one another. Long before she became Empress Dowager Cixi, before the silken robes and golden seals, before the trembling ministers bowed low at her presence, she was simply a girl named Yahenira. Born in 1835, in the fading light of the Qing dynasty, Yahenira came into the world far from the jade courtyards of the Forbidden City. Her family, though noble, had little wealth left. They were of Manchu descent, proud and traditional, clinging to titles that had begun to lose their meaning in an empire sagging under the weight of its own history. The girl who would become Cixi was not particularly destined for greatness, not in the beginning. Her father was an official of middling rank. Her mother, refined and quiet, kept the family together with a steady hand and a stoic smile. In their modest home in Beijing, life was structured and ceremonial, with small joys like poetry recitations and tea served in blue porcelain cups. But Yahenira had something rare in her, a glimmer in her eyes that spoke of something more, more than duty, more than tradition. She listened keenly to conversations she wasn't meant to hear. She noticed the tremble in her father's voice when he spoke of court politics. And she asked questions. Far too many, some thought, for a girl. She read the ancient classics, not just for education, but for power. She memorized the histories of emperors and the rise and fall of dynasties. She lingered over the stories of imperial concubines, those forgotten women who once wielded quiet influence in rooms scented with incense and fear. Even as a girl, she understood something essential about her world. In the Qin court, silence was a language, and survival was a game. By the time she was a teenager, Yehenra was already regarded as clever, perhaps too clever. Her beauty was noted, but it was her presence that startled those around her. Calm, observant, as if she were already waiting for something to unfold. And unfold it did. At 16, she was selected to be one of the many concubines of the young Emperor Xianfeng. Her family's fortune soared overnight. Their daughter would live in the Forbidden City. Their name would be remembered. But behind the celebration was a mother's quiet dread. Because once a girl entered the palace, she never truly returned. And so, dear dreamer, Yehenra left her childhood behind. The gates of the Forbidden City opened, and she stepped into a world of whispered danger and exquisite cruelty. A world where a single glance could shift power, and a single word could ruin a life. She wore silk now, but each thread felt like a tether. The concubines were numbered by rank, not by name. She was given the title, Noble Lady Lan. She was one of many. And yet, not one of them would forget her. She began, as all concubines did, with silence. But it was the kind of silence that watched, that listened, that waited. And in the long evenings beneath red lanterns, when others gossiped or wept, Yehenra studied the layout of the court, the patterns of attention, the moods of the emperor. She was no longer the curious girl of Beijing's alleyways. She was now part of the machinery of an empire, a gear in the most delicate, dangerous clockwork on earth. And yet, she would become its keeper. And so, as her girlhood fades into shadows, another chapter begins. Inside the Forbidden City, time moved differently. It did not march, it hovered. It drifted, soft and languid, like incense smoke curling through the rafters of the Hall of Supreme Harmony. And for Yehenra, now noble Lady Lan, the days were wrapped in ritual and silence. She awoke before dawn, to the muted light of lanterns. She was bathed, dressed, and adorned by silent maids whose faces never betrayed thought. Breakfast was served in lacquered bowls, untouched by heat, untouched by joy. And then, the waiting. For a concubine in the imperial court, life was an eternal audition for an audience that rarely came. A flutter of fan, a glimpse of a passing eunuch. The possibility, however distant, that the emperor might choose you that evening. Most days he did not. And yet Yehenra watched. She watched as jealousy rippled like waves through the harem, as smiles concealed daggers, as laughter echoed too loudly in empty halls. She was not the emperor's favorite. Not yet. But she played the long game. The Forbidden City itself was a kind of paradox, immense, yet claustrophobic. Towering halls and golden rooftops, but every step watched, every word weighed. Behind the splendor, behind the carved dragons and painted eaves, lived women like shadows, concubines, servants, dowagers, all vying for the illusion of influence. The empress, a woman named Jin, sat atop this delicate pyramid, serene and poised. She performed her duties with stoic grace, blessing rituals, overseeing ceremonies, and keeping a fragile peace among the women. But Empress Jin did not command her husband's affections. that belonged to another, consortly. Consortly was beautiful in the way peonies are beautiful, soft, ornate, a little proud. She laughed loudly and walked with the confidence of one who knew the emperor would come to her chambers again and again. And for a time, he did. But Yahenira did not envy Consortly. She studied her. She understood something very old, very true. Beauty fades, but attentiveness grows sharper. The emperor, weary from the burdens of rule, would soon hunger not for beauty, but for solace. For someone who listened. And so Yahenira listened. She listened to his officials, his moods, the changing tides of the court. She whispered intelligent things when others said nothing. She did not plead for affection, she offered peace. And when the emperor began to take notice of her, it was not with the passion of a man in love, but with the relief of a man understood. By the time she was promoted to consortee, it was already clear Yahenira was no ordinary concubine. She was a student of power, and she was playing a different game. Then, in 1856, something changed everything. She bore the emperor a son, a boy, healthy and strong, the emperor's only male heir. In a court ruled by sons and lineage, it was a turning point as silent as it was seismic. In that moment, Yahenira stopped being just a concubine. She became the mother of the future emperor. And the court trembled, though it did not yet know why. And so, as her whispers rise to a mother's pride, another thread in the tapestry is pulled. To give birth to the emperor's only son, it was both a blessing and a sentence. For Yahenira, now consortee, it meant a rise in rank, yes, but also a new layer of danger. Because the forbidden city did not rejoice in fortune. It waited, and it feared it. She named the boy Zaichuan, a quiet child, solemn beyond his years. In his first days, she held him close, swaddled in silk, with only the moonlight to witness her whispered lullabies. But even then, she knew, he was no longer hers. Not truly. He belonged to the dynasty now. The emperor, Xianfeng, was a man besieged. The Qing Empire was no longer what it once had been. Rebellion stirred in the south. The Taiping Rebellion, a movement of fire and fury, was threatening to tear China apart. Foreign powers, with their ships and smug arrogance, demanded trade and territory. Inside the court, rival factions plotted in silence, smiling over tea while twisting knives beneath the table. And so the emperor retreated, to the hills, to opium, to silence. He grew distant, both from his officials and his women. His decisions became erratic. His health declined, though no one dared say it aloud. And in this growing vacuum of power, something unexpected happened. The ministers began to consult Yahenira. They came in the guise of concern for the boy. After all, she was the mother of the heir. But they stayed longer than they needed. They asked her opinions on foreign policy, on court appointments, on troop movements. And though she spoke with humility, her words lingered in their minds. She understood what few women were ever permitted to grasp, the pulse of the state. She read the imperial memorials. She asked questions about the British envoy. She followed the conflict in Canton with the precision of a general. And still, she played the role of modest consort. But power has a scent, and the palace began to sense it on her. In 1861, the emperor fell gravely ill. Weakened by stress, addiction, and the erosion of his dynasty, he summoned his last strength to make one final decree. His son, Zaichuan, would succeed him upon his death. But the boy was only 5 years old. And here, dear dreamer, the emperor made a choice that would echo through history. He named 2 regents, Prince Gong, his half-brother, and a council of ministers. But he also granted the title of Empress Dowager to 2 women, Yahenira, and another consort, Xian. They were to oversee the young emperor's upbringing and act as co-regents. When Xianfeng died, he left behind a fragile empire, a child emperor, and a court filled with suspicion. And Empress Dowager Cixi, no longer just Yuhenera, was ready. She wore mourning robes, yes. She wept when expected. But behind the veil, her mind was already moving. The court expected her to fade quietly into ceremonial respectability. But she had no intention of retreating. The game had changed. She had a throne to protect, a son to guide, and a future to shape. And so, as the emperor's shadow falls, another rises beside it. In the brittle morning light of 1861, the Forbidden City mourned an emperor and prepared to crown a child. The boy Zaichuan, now known as the Tongji Emperor, was only 5 years old. Small, fragile, innocent in the way only children can be. And around him, walls circled in silence. The Regency Council, appointed by the late Emperor Xiefeng, wasted no time. 8 ministers, led by the imperious Su Sun, took control of the court. They dressed in righteousness, cloaked in Confucian duty, but their aim was clear: absolute power. Empress Dowager Cixi, still mourning in her white robes, was expected to remain behind screens, symbolic, ceremonial, silent. But dear dreamer, she had never been one for silence when it truly mattered. She allied herself with a quiet force in the court, Prince Gong, the emperor's half-brother. Shrewd and cautious, he had navigated the stormy seas of diplomacy during the Second Opium War. Like Cixi, he understood power's fragile balance. And like her, he was not content to see it squandered by men who mistook obedience for wisdom. And so, the Empress Dowager began to plan. Carefully, quietly, with the slow precision of a spider rebuilding its web. The coup would become known as the Xinyo coup, named for the year in the Chinese calendar. But it did not begin with swords. It began with documents, with seals, with ceremony. On the 6th day of the 10th lunar month, under the pretense of escorting the boy emperor from the Jihole's summer palace back to Beijing, Cixi and her co-regent Empress Dowager Cixi set the pieces in motion. Prince Gong, waiting in the capital, had already prepared the city's guard. The Regency ministers, unaware, believed all was proceeding under their authority. But as the young emperor entered the Forbidden City, the gates did not open to the ministers. Instead, they were summoned before the Empress Dowagers and accused of corruption, arrogance, and betrayal of imperial trust. It was done without a sword drawn, without a drop of blood spilled in public. Su Sun was arrested, tried in secret, and executed. The remaining regents were dismissed or banished. And just like that, in a whisper of paper and power, the court belonged to Cixi. She did not take the throne for herself. That would have been unthinkable. Instead, she rolled from behind it, literally. A yellow silk screen was placed between her and the court during audiences. The young emperor sat in front, but the voice, the mind, the decision came from the woman behind the curtain. The phrase, "Chua Lian Tingjing," ruling from behind the curtain, entered the Chinese lexicon that year. A poetic, almost ghostly image. A reminder that sometimes the true ruler is not the one seen, but the one whose breast stirs the fabric of history. Now, dear dreamer, imagine it, the boy emperor, small on his dragon throne, and behind him, veiled in silk and shadow, the quiet presence of his mother, guiding, correcting, deciding. It was the beginning of her true reign. And so, as one curtain falls in the palace, another is drawn back ever so gently. It is one thing, dear dreamer, to seize power. It is quite another to wield it. Empress Dowager Cixi had removed the regency ministers with elegance and swiftness. But now, she faced a new challenge, governing a vast and trembling empire through the eyes of a child. At just 5 years old, The Tongji Emperor could barely grasp the weight of the jade seal placed before him. But it didn't matter, because behind him, hidden behind a yellow silk screen, sat his true regent, Cixi. In court meetings, she did not appear. Not fully. She sat behind the emperor's throne, her voice drifting softly through the screen as she issued decisions. Ministers would bow to the child, but they listened to the woman behind him. The fiction of his rule was carefully preserved. The reality belonged to her. She was not alone, of course. Empress Dowager Cixi, her co-regent, was still by her side. Cixi was noble, cautious, and kind, an ideal complement to Cixi's steel-edged will. They rolled together in name, but it was Cixi's vision that shaped policy. Cixi, ever the dutiful consort, rarely contested her counterpart's growing confidence. The early years of her regency were marked not by tyranny, but by restraint. She stabilized the court, restored discipline, and surrounded the child emperor with tutors and guardians. She reviewed edicts herself. She even invited scholar officials to speak freely, a rare and dangerous generosity in an imperial court. But power, as always, breeds enemies. Traditionalists whispered behind lacquered doors. Who was this woman, this former concubine, to direct the affairs of the Son of Heaven? What business had she, lecturing generals or reshaping diplomatic strategies? And yet she did, with calm, deliberate force. Cixi was no ideologue. She was a pragmatist. She believed in ritual, but not when it interfered with survival. She preserved the symbols of the Qing, but she was not shackled by them. When faced with foreign diplomats, she did not close the gates in defiance. She listened. She negotiated. She learned. The empire, meanwhile, was still bleeding. The Taiping Rebellion had not yet ended. Other provinces simmered with unrest. Foreign powers, British, French, Russian, prowled the coast like hungry dogs. And all the while, Cixi guided the dynasty with a steady, if invisible, hand. Her days began before sunrise. She read memorials, made appointments, issued orders, all while tending to the delicate fiction of her son's rule. In the evenings, she returned to her private quarters, where she painted flowers, read poetry, and sipped tea in silence. She was still, after all, a woman, a mother, a widow. And yet, every morning, she stepped back behind the curtain. She was building something quiet, something strong. A system of governance that balanced old Confucian ideals with the brutal necessities of a world changing far too quickly. She knew the empire could not last forever, but she would hold it together as long as she could, because it was not just her son's legacy at stake. It was hers. And so, as her shadow lengthens behind the throne, another story stirs in the quiet halls of power. He was called the Tongji Emperor, but to her, he was simply Zaichuan. The boy whom Cixi had once held in swaddling silk, nestled beneath moonlight, was now a child emperor perched on a golden throne far too large for his tiny frame. His robes trailed on the marble floor. His crown, though light, sat heavy with ancient expectation. He played at being emperor, reciting rituals, nodding solemnly at court, repeating the words whispered to him from behind the yellow screen. But in his heart, he was still a boy who missed his mother's lap, who feared the hollow echo of palace corridors, who looked to the silken curtain behind him for strength. Cixi, for all her iron resolve, loved him deeply. She had not been given many gifts in life, but this child, this small, serious child, was hers. She wanted him strong, wise, capable of leading a dying empire into rebirth. And so, she filled his days with learning. The emperor's tutors were the best China could offer. They instructed him in the Confucian classics, military strategy, calligraphy, and etiquette. Every gesture was rehearsed, every word measured. He learned how to hold an audience, how to mask emotion, how to give orders he barely understood. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Cixi was not like his mother. He lacked her patience, her insight, her ferocious will. He chafed at the endless lessons, the crushing loneliness of the palace, the cold discipline of those around him. He longed for freedom, not just from court, but from the great expectations stitched into every fiber of his dragon robe. By the time he reached adolescence, he had grown restless. Cixi tried to guide him, to prepare him for the day when she would step aside and let him truly rule. But it became increasingly clear he did not want the burden. Or worse, he could not bear it. There were quiet rumors that the emperor avoided his studies, that he spent long hours with eunuchs who told him coarse jokes and taught him to gamble, that he was often absent from morning audiences. Cixi, furious but discreet, intervened behind the scenes, replacing tutors, chastising courtiers, trying to shield him from his own weaknesses. But she could not stop time. In 1873, when the boy was 17, the court declared him of age. With great pomp and ancient ceremony, the Tongji emperor held his first audience without the yellow curtain. He sat alone. His mother watched from the shadows, and the ministers bowed, first to him, then, in silent habit, to where she had once sat. Cixi had ruled for 12 years. Now, in theory, she was to retire into the calm silence of the dowager's quarters. But peace would not come. For Cixi, now free, sought escape. Not in governance, but in pleasure. He disappeared for nights at a time, visited brothels, ignored advice. And when courtiers attempted to intervene, he raged like a trapped bird, flailing against expectations that had been placed upon him since he was 5. And then, in 1875, the empire held its breath. Cixi fell ill. Smallpox, they said. Or perhaps syphilis, whispered others. No one knew for certain, or perhaps no one dared say. What is known is that within weeks, the Son of Heaven was dead. Barely 19. Cixi was devastated. She had lost not only her child, but her vision, her heir, her hope. In the silence of mourning, as bells tolled and robes turned white once more, she was faced with the impossible. The emperor was gone, and the dynasty had no son to carry its name. And so, as the boy emperor fades into memory, another chapter waits to be chosen. The imperial line was broken. When the Tongji emperor died in 1875, barely out of boyhood, the Qing dynasty stood stunned. The celestial succession, meant to be as eternal as the North Star, had faltered. He left no sons, no brothers, no clear heir. And within the walls of the forbidden city, silence turned into murmurs, and murmurs into panic. In theory, the court should have chosen a successor from a generation below. But custom dictated that the new emperor be a direct descendant of the previous one. And that was impossible now. Unless the past could be bent. Quietly. Elegantly. Empress Dowager Cixi, still dressed in mourning, now wielded the one power that remained truly hers, decision. She had once placed a child on the throne. She would do so again. But this time, she would choose carefully. Among the many branches of the imperial family, one child caught her eye. His name was Cixi. Just 4 years old, bright-eyed, and fragile as a reed in the autumn wind. He was not her son, but he was her sister's. Her own flesh and blood, born into the extended Aizenjoro clan. A child she had once bounced on her lap. He would become the Guangxu emperor. The ministers hesitated. Some protested. He was too young, they said. The ritual lines of succession did not flow so easily. But Cixi, poised and calm, argued her case with that deadly grace for which she had become known. She pointed to the dynastic precedents. She invoked the need for continuity. She wrapped her choice in Confucian silk and made it law. And so, for the second time, she placed the child upon the dragon throne. And for the second time, she returned to her seat behind the yellow screen. Guangxu, like Zaichun before him, was given every tool an emperor could need, except freedom. His days were filled with recitation and ritual, with ministers and tutors who watched his every blink. And always, behind him, the quiet breath of Cixi's rule. She ruled again as regent, not in name but in deed. Her influence was absolute, though always cloaked in ceremony. She revived imperial finances, restored decaying infrastructure, strengthened diplomatic ties with foreign nations. She played the roles of both emperor and dowager, weaving the threads of governance while pretending to observe. She had learned from Tongji's failure. This boy would not be left to his own devices. This boy would be molded. But Cixi, too, was changing. She had spent nearly 2 decades in power. The young girl who had once walked through the palace gates in fear was now its quiet master. She had outlived her husband, her son, and many of her rivals. And yet, the world outside the Forbidden City moved faster than ever. Railroads, telegraphs, steamships. Foreign ideas seeped into the cracks of China's old stone walls. Revolution whispered in dialects the court barely understood. Reformers emerged, scholars and thinkers who questioned the mandate of heaven, who wondered aloud whether emperors were needed at all. But for now, the empire remained under her hand. And she, too, was watching. And so, as one child's reign ends in sorrow, another begins beneath the same curtain of silk. By the time the Guangxu Emperor's small hands clutched the armrests of the dragon throne, Empress Dowager Cixi had become a figure of myth within the walls of the Forbidden City. Ministers whispered her name with reverence and fear. Servants bowed deeper in her presence. Foreign dignitaries, arriving with maps and motives, left in awe of the woman who ruled behind a screen of embroidered silk. But power, dear dreamer, is a lonely garden. Cixi was now in her 40s. Still regal. Still sharp. Still clothed in robes of imperial gold. But the candlelight of her reign now cast longer shadows. Her allies were fewer. Her decisions carried heavier echoes. She had outlived the man she once adored, the son she had mourned, and many of the officials who had underestimated her. She ruled now as only she could, with elegance, caution, and an eye fixed firmly on survival. These were her years of autumn light. The days when she ruled alone in truth, if not in name. The Guangxu Emperor, too young and too gentle, offered no challenge to her authority. And so she filled the void with action. She reinstated old Confucian exams, but began to allow limited modern knowledge into their curriculum. She cautiously welcomed Western advisors, not into the court, but into the outskirts of policy. Railroads began to snake across the Chinese countryside. Telegraph lines buzzed in a language of dots and dashes. And foreign embassies, permanent ones, were now a part of Beijing's diplomatic life. But for every step forward, there was hesitation. Cixi was no revolutionary. She saw the dangers in modernization, in opening China too fast, too wide. She feared the chaos that might come if too much changed too quickly. The dynasty, after all, was not built for speed. It was a vast river, winding and slow, resistant to waves. Her days followed the same rhythm, early court meetings behind the curtain, followed by hours reviewing memorials from across the empire. She corrected calligraphy with a steady hand, annotated military requests in delicate brushstrokes. She dictated, listened, advised, refused. At night, she returned to her private gardens. There, beneath flowering magnolia trees, she would paint. Not with bold strokes, but with careful detail. Tiny birds perched on willow branches, boats drifting down misty rivers. Her scrolls were praised by visiting diplomats, who never guessed they were glimpses into the quietest corners of her soul. She missed companionship, but trust had long been a currency she could not afford. Even Empress Dowager Cixi, once her gentle co-regent, had grown distant. The two women had rarely agreed in recent years. Where Cixi favored strength and discretion, Cixi preferred balance and ceremony. Some whispered they had argued over the Guangxu emperor's upbringing. Others claimed Cixi had grown tired of ruling in Cixi's shadow. Then, in 1881, Cixi died suddenly. No illness was widely reported. No foul play was proven. But the court fell silent with unease. For now, Cixi stood truly alone. She wore mourning robes again. She had worn them too many times by now. But this time, she did not retreat. Instead, she expanded. She took on all court functions, all decisions, all the weight of the empire's future. And in doing so, she became something rare, not just a regent, not just a mother of emperors, but the single, undisputed voice of the Qing dynasty. And so, as petals fall in her garden of solitude, another storm begins to stir beyond the walls. It was the 1880s, dear dreamer, and the air in China began to shift. Not with typhoons or tempests, but with the dry wind of unfamiliar ideas. From the west came newspapers, telegraphs, and railroads. From Japan, once a little brother in the shadows of Chinese tradition, came modern arsenals, modern schools, and a startling defeat of an old way of life. And into this breeze stepped a new generation. They were scholars, young, hungry, daring. Men who had passed their Confucian exams but looked, wide-eyed, toward Berlin, London, and Tokyo. They read translated political theory by Oil Lamp. They discussed democracy in hushed tones. They believed, with the zeal of those born into fading worlds, that China could still awaken. They called for reform. They spoke of a constitutional monarchy, of public education, of a new economy built not on tribute, but on industry. They whispered, then shouted, for an empire that could face the 20th century with steel, not scrolls. And in the heart of the Forbidden City, a quiet emperor listened. The Guangxu emperor, now nearing adulthood, had grown up in Cixi's careful shadow. He was quiet, uncertain, observant. But he carried within him a soft rebellion, a longing to be more than a puppet. He admired the reformers. He read their essays in secret. He wondered, in the solitude of his golden halls, if perhaps he could be the one to save the dynasty from itself. And Cixi, she watched him. She had raised him, shaped him, protected him. But now, she began to sense a quiet pulling away. Guangxu met in private with reform-minded ministers. He wrote poems about change. He spoke in metaphors, about winds, and rivers, and broken bridges. She understood them all too well. At first, she tolerated it. Let the boy dream, she thought. The machinery of court would dull those dreams in time. But time, as ever, had grown impatient. In 1894, war broke out between China and Japan, the first Sino-Japanese war. And it was a disaster. China's once feared navy was crushed. Korea, long considered a vassal state, was lost. And with it, a great deal of pride. Cixi was furious. The military officials she had trusted had failed. The dynasty's prestige was shattered. Foreign powers moved in like vultures, carving spheres of influence into the once mighty empire. And Guangxu saw an opportunity. He declared it was time for change. Real change. Not just in rituals and robes, but in law, in governance, in structure. In 1898, he launched what would become known as the 100 Days Reform. It was bold, it was sweeping, and it was fast. New universities, new ministries, the abolition of outdated exams, plans for constitutional government. The emperor signed dozens of edicts in rapid succession. Young reformers celebrated. The court gasped. And Cixi? She remained silent. For a time. Behind the screens, behind the painted fans, she watched the whirlwind unfold. She did not object openly. But neither did she lend her hand. She waited. And she listened. And when the moment came, when Guangxu moved to strip conservative princes of their titles and dismiss old military commanders, she struck. In September of 1898, the palace doors closed. Reformers were arrested. Some were executed. Guangxu was placed under house arrest in a secluded palace on a lake. His reign reduced to echoing footsteps and locked doors. Cixi returned to power, unopposed. She said little. She smiled faintly. And behind her was a silence heavier than thunder. The 100 days were over. And so, as dreams of reform vanish like smoke in the wind, the empire breathes on, but more fragile than before. The summer palace shimmered in the sunlight, its lake rippling gently beneath the pavilions of painted wood and faded glory. Here, in a quiet corner known as Ingtai Island, a young man stared at his own reflection in the water. He was the emperor of China, and he was a prisoner. The Guangxu emperor, once filled with fragile hope, now lived alone. No court, no power, no freedom. His meals were delivered in silence. His letters were read before they ever reached a courier. The gates were always closed. His reign continued in name only, a hollow title echoed by courtiers who bowed to an absence. Cixi had reclaimed control. It was not a dramatic return. No coronation. No decree. She simply resumed her morning audiences. She reviewed state affairs. Officials once aligned with the reformers returned to her side, speaking again in the old language of tradition and obedience. And she ruled, once more, as the Empress Dowager behind the throne. But she was not the same woman who had risen behind the yellow curtain all those years ago. She was older now, wiser, tired perhaps, but never weakened. She had outlived emperors, outmaneuvered ministers, and survived revolutions that never had the chance to name themselves. She saw the reformers not as visionaries, but as children with matches in a paper house. And so, she moved carefully. Though the 100 days were over, not all progress vanished. Some reforms remained, reshaped under her direction. She commissioned the construction of modern infrastructure. She even allowed select schools to teach foreign languages and sciences. But politics, governance, those belonged to her. The Guangxu emperor, now in his 20s, was permitted visitors only with her approval. Rumors grew like ivy around his island prison. Some said he wept each night. Others said he wrote poems that no one ever read. A few whispered that he still hoped she would one day release him. But she did not. Perhaps she feared what he might become if free. Or perhaps she mourned him in her own quiet way. After all, she had raised him, protected him, loved him, in the only way she could love, with a grip too strong to escape. She sometimes sent him gifts, books, paintings, fruit from the imperial orchards, but never freedom, never trust. Outside the palace, the world grew restless. Foreign powers grew bolder. German, French, British, Russian, and Japanese soldiers were now common sights in treaty ports. Missionaries preached in cities once closed to the West. The Chinese people, once so steeped in Confucian calm, began to stir. Secret societies multiplied. Some sought reform, others revenge. One such group, born in the northern provinces, would soon ignite a firestorm that even Cixi could not ignore. But for now, within the walls of the Forbidden City, all was quiet. The dragon throne sat empty more often than not. The emperor lived alone on an island, and Cixi rolled from her favorite pavilion, beneath carved dragons and painted clouds. She was alone now, but in power. And so, as the empire slumbers beneath uneasy skies, another fire begins to flicker in the distance. At the turn of the century, dear dreamer, China stood at a precipice, not with fanfare or celebration, but with clenched fists and broken earth. The winds from the provinces carried not just dust, but rage. The people had grown weary. Foreign powers had carved deep wounds into the country. Economic concessions, territorial thefts, missionary protections that trampled on ancestral beliefs. Railroads sliced through sacred ground. Opium still poisoned the veins of cities. And the old imperial dignity? It was little more than a faded scroll. And then, from the north, came the fists. They called themselves the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists. To Westerners, they became simply the Boxers. Farmers, laborers, students, ordinary souls burned by humiliation, turned to mysticism, martial arts, and ancient incantations. They believed they could become invincible, that they could stop bullets, that they could purify the land of foreign corruption. Their slogans sped like wildfire. Support the Qing. Exterminate the foreigners. At first, Cixi watched from afar. Her officials dismissed the Boxers as peasants chasing illusions. But when the Boxers began burning churches, attacking missionaries, and slaughtering Chinese converts in Shandong and Hebei, the court could no longer look away. The empire was on fire. And in this fire, Cixi saw something both terrifying and useful. For years, she had juggled the impossible: protect the dynasty, manage foreign pressures, and keep her own people from rising in fury. Now, the fury had risen, and while many urged her to suppress the Boxers, others, especially conservative nobles, urged her to embrace them. The question hung in the air like incense. Should the dynasty stand with the foreigners, or with its people? In June of 1900, the decision came. Cixi declared war on the foreign powers. It was a shocking, desperate move. The Boxers flooded into Beijing. Foreign embassies were besieged. The legation quarter, a patch of land home to diplomats and their families, was surrounded. Gunfire echoed through the capital. Foreign civilians dug trenches, armed themselves, and waited for rescue. Cixi, meanwhile, issued edicts rallying the empire against the invaders. She praised the Boxers as patriots. Imperial troops joined the uprising. Temples burned. Crosses shattered. The great city teetered on the edge of apocalypse. But the world would not wait. 8 nations, Britain, France, Germany, Japan, Russia, the United States, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, formed an alliance. Their armies marched from Tianjin to Beijing, crushing resistance as they came. The Boxers, brave but ill-equipped, were slaughtered in droves. Qing troops fell back. Cities were looted. Villages razed. And on August 14, 1900, foreign soldiers stormed into Beijing. The imperial court had fled days earlier. Disguised in peasant garb, Cixi boarded a wooden cart and rode into the countryside. She was no longer an empress, but a widow in exile, bouncing on broken roads to fields choked with smoke. The forbidden city stood looted, its treasures plundered, the dragon throne empty once more. And so, for the first time in half a century, the woman who had ruled an empire vanished into the horizon. The Boxer rebellion had failed. But it was more than that. It was the empire's reckoning. And so, as the flames die in the capital, and the stars blink over fields of ash, a nation holds its breath for what comes next. The dust clung to her robes. She had once moved through palaces scented with sandalwood, her steps silent upon marble floors. Now, the Empress Dowager Cixi rode through dry villages and cracked fields, hidden in plain sight, dressed in the coarse garments of a widow. The golden phoenix of her headpiece had been replaced by a simple scarf. Her silks were folded away. Her empire had vanished. It was the autumn of 1900. She was 65 years old. And she was fleeing. The imperial court, reduced to a scattered retinue, traveled west towards Xi'an, an ancient city, once the seat of emperors, now a refuge of desperation. Along the way, they relied on the hospitality of local officials, hastily swept corridors, and hastily prepared meals. The journey was not ceremonial. It was survival. And yet, she did not break. Each morning, she rose before dawn, as she always had. She reviewed memorials, consulted ministers, kept the machinery of state moving even as its wheels were buried in mud. She held daily court, outdoors, sometimes beneath trees, or in borrowed halls lit by flickering lanterns. Her brush still glided across rice paper with imperial precision. She was not finished. In Xi'an, she reorganized the government, sent envoys, collected reports of the occupation in Beijing. She read of looting, of foreign flags flying from palace roofs, of ancient bronzes stolen, scrolls burned, eunuchs tortured for secrets. But she never cried in public. Not once. Privately, perhaps. Her nights were spent in a borrowed palace, cold and quiet. She would sit by the window, tea growing cold beside her, and stare out at the unfamiliar horizon. The child Emperor Guanxi remained with her, but their relationship had been hollowed by years of silence. He walked the halls like a ghost, his presence a reminder of what had been lost. The court feared Cixi would never return, that the dynasty itself had ended. But empires, dear dreamer, do not die all at once. They fade, they stagger, and sometimes they return. In September of 1901, after over a year in exile, an agreement was reached. The Boxer Protocol, as it would be known, was a document of humiliation. China would pay vast indemnities, fortify no cities, punish remaining rebels, allow foreign soldiers to garrison Beijing. It was not a peace, it was a surrender. But it allowed for one thing: the court could return. And so, in early 1902, Empress Dowager Cixi began the long journey home. But this time, it was no flight through dusty fields. It was a procession. She ordered flowers to be planted along the roads, temples repainted, roads repaired. She traveled not as a fugitive, but as a ruler returning in triumph. It was illusion, perhaps, but in the empire of the Qin, illusion often stood in place of truth. The people welcomed her. They knelt as she passed. They cheered, wept, burned incense. And perhaps, just perhaps, they believed. Believed that she was still the guardian of the Middle Kingdom, still the hand that held the sky. When she entered the Forbidden City once more, the halls echoed with ghosts. The foreign soldiers had gone, but the empire they left behind was changed forever. And Cixi knew it. She had lost the war, lost the illusion of strength, but she had not lost her throne. And so, as the gates closed behind her once more, and the red walls cast long shadows in the afternoon light, she begins the final chapter of her reign. She had returned. The red walls of the Forbidden City once again echoed with her steps, measured, deliberate, unyielding. Empress Dowager Cixi was back where she belonged. But everything, dear dreamer, had changed. The empire she now ruled was no longer veiled in illusions. The Boxer Rebellion had shattered the last glass panels of imperial pride. Foreign troops had walked where only emperors once dared tread. Treaties had been signed in ink that tasted of salt and ash. The people, though still kneeling, had begun to look up. And Cixi saw it all. She had spent a lifetime resisting reform. Now she would lead it. Slowly, carefully, elegantly. The woman who once dismissed steamships now approved railway lines. The empress who once expelled missionaries now permitted schools that taught not only Confucian classics, but mathematics, geography, and foreign languages. She ordered the establishment of China's first modern Navy academy, a postal system, a ministry of education. She even opened the door, just a crack, to the idea of a constitutional monarchy. It was a transformation not in words, but in silence. She made no grand announcements, no self-congratulation. She simply issued edicts, appointed reformers, and swept away the dead leaves of older ways. Those who had watched her suppress the 100 Days reform now watched in astonishment as she enacted reforms of her own. And yet she did it all with the same imperial grace. To the court, she remained the Dragon Lady, the guardian of tradition. To the diplomats who watched carefully from afar, she was suddenly reasonable, even progressive. But for Cixi, none of this was contradiction. She believed she had never opposed progress itself, only the recklessness of its delivery. She had not feared change, she said, but chaos. And now, having survived the chaos, she would steer the change. Guangxu, meanwhile, still lived. He remained confined to a quiet palace near the lake, rarely seen, rarely heard. Occasionally, Cixi summoned him for ceremonial events, but they spoke little. Whatever bond had once existed between them had long since turned to vapor. And still, she ruled. She awoke early, met with her ministers, signed documents with a hand that, though slower now, never trembled. She walked her gardens in the evening light, beneath willows that had watched her grow from consort to sovereign. She read poetry again, old poems of loss and cycles, of seasons turning. She understood them better now. Her health began to fail in those years. She caught colds more easily. Her appetite waned. Her physicians prepared ginseng and deerhorn soup, but even the finest tonics could not stall the slow drift of age. She grew thinner, more silent. The fire that had once burned in her eyes dimmed, but never vanished. And then, in 1908, the whispers began. The Guangxu emperor was dying. Some said poison, others said despair. No proof was ever given. But one thing is certain, on November 14, 1908, he passed away, suddenly, quietly, and still imprisoned in his palace by the lake. The very next day, Empress Dowager Cixi followed. She died at 73, in the palace she had once entered as a concubine, and thus ended the life of the last great empress of China, a woman who ruled for nearly 5 decades without ever wearing a crown. She left behind a child emperor once more, Huai, just 2 years old, placed on the throne by her final decree, a final echo of her will. And so, as the candles burn low in the hall of supreme harmony, and the silken curtains fall gently to rest, we close the first great arc of our story. But not its end. For now, as the woman who outlived an empire is laid to rest, another figure takes her place beneath the same jade sky. And now, dear dreamer, we come to the child. He was named Eisenjoro Plai, barely 2 years old, with eyes too round and too soft for the weight they were meant to carry. He had not yet learned to speak in full sentences. He had only just begun to walk without stumbling. And yet, he was chosen, by Cixi, in her final days, to inherit the very sky. he became the Xiantong Emperor. Imagine the moment, a toddler wrapped in ceremonial silk, held aloft as the son of heaven, incense burning in thick coils above his head. Ministers kneeling so low their foreheads touched the marble floor. A throne towering above him like a mountain carved in gold. And somewhere in the back of the hall of supreme harmony, a hush of disbelief. Because everyone knew this was the end. Cixi had rolled with fire and silk, but her empire had already begun to drift into dream. The new emperor's reign, though grand in name, began in whispers and shadows. Behind the ceremonies, behind the dragon motifs embroidered on infant robes, there was only uncertainty. A regency council was formed. His father, Prince Chun, acted on his behalf. But the ministers bickered. The reforms Cixi had begun were now too little, too late. The court, hollowed by years of fear and inertia, could not find its footing. Outside the palace, storm clouds gathered. And in the streets, the people had changed. They no longer bowed with blind reverence. They read newspapers. They attended schools. They heard ideas spoken in bold new tongues: republic, revolution, equality. Students in Wuhan, merchants in Shanghai, soldiers on the northern frontier, all of them whispered the same name: Sun Yat-sen. A physician turned revolutionary, Sun Yat-sen had long called for the end of the Qing dynasty. He envisioned a republic, modern, free from Manchu rule, driven by the will of the people. For years he had plotted from exile. Now, with the throne held by a child and the court in chaos, his moment had arrived. And it came with the sound of gunfire. In 1911, the Wuchang uprising sparked flames that spread like dry grass. Provinces declared independence from the Qing. Soldiers refused orders. Banners were burned. The revolution that had long simmered beneath China's ancient surface now erupted with startling speed. Inside the Forbidden City, panic turned to resignation. The regents could not quell the rebellion. Negotiations began. And in early 1912, just weeks after the boy emperor celebrated his third birthday, a decision was made. On behalf of the child who could not yet hold a breath, an edict of abdication was signed. The Qing dynasty, founded in 1644, guardian of 5 centuries of imperial China, was no more. But the child remained. Huai was allowed to stay in the palace for a time, to walk its vast courtyards, to sleep beneath painted ceilings. But he no longer ruled. He was an emperor only in name, a figure kept for ceremony, for nostalgia, for quiet remembrance. And so, dear dreamer, the empire fell not with a thunderclap, but with the soft closing of a door. A door that had stood for thousands of years. The last emperor, barely out of the arms of his nursemaids, now watched from gilded windows as the world reshaped itself beyond the walls. And so, as the dragon throne cools beneath a fading dynasty, a new age dawns beyond the crimson gates. After the edict was signed, after the dynasty dissolved like ink in water, the Forbidden City did not echo with revolution. It echoed with silence. The courtiers had gone. The imperial guards replaced. The banners removed. But inside the red walls, the last emperor still lived. And the air, oh dear dreamer, the air still carried the scent of sandalwood and old rituals. Huai, the boy who once sat on the dragon throne, remained within the palace by agreement with the new republic. He was allowed to live like an emperor, though he no longer was one. The arrangement was strange, like a dream that refused to end even after the dreamer had awakened. His household continued in miniature. Eunuchs still flitted through corridors with bowed heads. His robes were still embroidered with dragons. His mornings still began with rituals to ancestors who no longer ruled the living. But beyond the palace walls, the world changed rapidly, and it no longer waited on ceremony. In the first weeks after the abdication, little changed. Pui was still a child, still surrounded by silk and silence. He did not understand that the throne he had inherited no longer meant anything. He still received reports written in archaic script. He still held court, alone. He still thought he was emperor. But others began to understand. His courtiers were caught in the stillness between two eras. Some remained out of loyalty, others out of fear. But more and more, the walls of the palace became a kind of prison. The Republic, modern and loud, surrounded the ancient city like an incoming tide. Pui's regents tried to shield him, but whispers crept in. Outside, children played with kites made of newspapers that carry news of a president, not an emperor. Western clothes appeared in the capital. New voices echoed in Tiananmen Square. And within the walls, old officials began to look over their shoulders. The boy began to grow restless. He wanted to ride bicycles, but the palace was not meant for bicycles. He wanted to read books, but they were written in scripts older than his thoughts. He became curious, petulant, lonely. His eyes, once wide with innocent awe, became shadowed with confusion. In his dreams, he still sat on the throne. In waking life, he sat by the pond and watched the koi fish circle, trapped, like him, in a world that no longer existed. Cixi's ghost lingered in the palace, not as a spirit, but in the very structure of the place. In the hall she walked, the pavilion she commanded, the traditions she sustained. Her empire was gone, but its shell remained, and her great-grandson now drifted within it, like a feather caught in still air. The Forbidden City became a museum of a dynasty still alive, but only barely. And so, as the child emperor wanders the silent corridors of his vanished kingdom, a strange kind of twilight settles over the red roofs of old Peking. Imagine, dear dreamer, a child growing up in a world preserved in amber. Outside, the new century hummed with machines, trams, factories, and Western suits. But inside the Forbidden City, the clocks had stopped. The world had moved on. But not the boy. Not the palace. Not the ghosts. Pui, now no longer an emperor, and not quite a citizen, drifted through the crimson corridors like a spirit in his own home. His toys were carved jade lions. His bedtime stories were tales of golden dragons and ancient sages. He had no playmates. Only eunuchs and attendants who still bowed too low and spoke in voices too soft. He was both worshipped and ignored. Outside the walls, China was learning to speak a new language, of republics, elections, even revolutions. But no one taught those words to Pui. He learned from tutors selected by the court, taught the dynastic classics, taught to bow to ancestors, taught to write with brush and ink. Yet nothing he learned prepared him for a life without power. He asked questions no one dared answer. Why can't I go beyond the wall? Why do the soldiers at the gate wear different uniforms? Why does the world not listen to me anymore? Sometimes, at night, he wandered alone, through the hall of supreme harmony, now empty, through gardens where no ministers walked. He watched the moonlight silver the roofs of the imperial city and wondered, not for the last time, whether he had dreamed the entire thing. Was he ever truly an emperor? He had moments of rebellion. He threw tantrums when his will was denied. He demanded audiences with no one to receive them. He ordered punishments that were never carried out. And slowly, the courtiers around him stopped pretending. One by one, the bowing lessened. The silence deepened. And yet, he still wore the robes. They dressed him each morning in imperial silk. They fixed his queue in the Manchu style. They opened scrolls and pretended to read reports of provinces that no longer answered to his name. The Forbidden City became a stage, and Pui, the last performer. Outside the palace, The city of Beijing was changing its skin. Republican posters adorned walls. Crowds gathered in streets. Foreigners walked freely, cameras around their necks. And through the great red gates, whispers came of warlords, of coups, of generals who ruled like kings in distant provinces. But none of that reached the boy. His prison was velvet. His chains were silk. One day, while looking into the polished surface of an old bronze mirror, Huai asked a eunuch, "If I am not emperor, what am I?" The eunuch, trembling, could not answer. And neither could anyone else, because there were no answers left in that place. Only memories. Only fading echoes. And so, dear dreamer, the last emperor lived on, not as ruler, not as subject, but as an orphan of a vanished age. A boy born too late for the old world, and too early for the new. And so, as the mist gather in the quiet courtyards of memory, we close another chapter in the story of the woman who ruled, and the boy she left behind. And then, into the stillness, came a stranger. In 1919, a man arrived at the gates of the Forbidden City. He was not Manchu, not Chinese. He carried no jade tablet or imperial decree. He wore spectacles, Western shoes, and a face full of curiosity. His name was Reginald Johnston, a Scottish academic sent to tutor the boy who was once emperor. And so, dear dreamer, the silence began to crack. Johnston was unlike anyone Huai had ever met. He spoke plainly, without bowing. He brought books bound not in silk but in leather. He spoke of history, not just of China, but of the world. He introduced Huai to Shakespeare, science, astronomy. He taught him to type on a typewriter, to wear spectacles like a scholar, to think beyond the red walls. And the boy listened, at first cautiously, then hungrily. Johnston saw something in Huai, a mind restless and stifled, trapped in rituals long dead. The tutor did not insult the past, but he made space for the future. And Huai, for the first time, began to imagine himself not as the shadow of an emperor, but perhaps as a man. He cut his queue, that long braid of Manchu tradition, in a gesture that echoed through the palace like a thunderclap. Eunuchs wept. The old guards looked away. But Huai, small and thin and dressed in a Western suit, felt taller than he had in years. He rode a bicycle through the inner courts. He took photographs with a foreign camera. He installed a telephone. The Forbidden City, once sealed like a tomb, now flickered with signs of life. But not everyone welcomed the change. The old household bristled. The eunuchs, guardians of the past, whispered that the spirits would be angered, that the child emperor was being poisoned by foreign lies, that the court, already a ghost, would now be marked outright. And perhaps they were right. But perhaps, too, it was time. Huai began to read newspapers. He studied the fall of monarchies, the rise of republics. He asked questions no emperor before him would have dared ask. Could I go abroad? What does it mean to be free? Can an emperor live as a man? Johnston, ever the careful guide, never answered directly. But he encouraged curiosity. He believed that the last emperor might yet find a future, if not on a throne, then on his own 2 feet. And yet, even as the young man grew in confidence, the world outside the walls darkened again. Warlords fought for control of Beijing. The Republic fractured. Foreign powers once more circled China's coastlines like sharks sensing blood. And within the palace, theft and decay spread quietly. The eunuchs had begun stealing imperial treasures, scrolls, jade carvings, relics once held in sacred reverence. They smuggled them out through secret passages, sold them to antique dealers and diplomats. The coffers were emptying. The soul of the palace was being dismantled piece by piece. Huai, enraged, tried to stop it. He dismissed hundreds of eunuchs. He locked storerooms. But the damage was done. The Forbidden City was no longer a sanctuary. It was a sinking ship. And so, as Western footsteps echo through ancestral halls, and a boy becomes a man beneath a sky no longer his to command, the last embers of a vanished world flicker once more. The year was 1924. The shadows were long now, dear dreamer, and in the courtyards of the Forbidden City, dust gathered on the flagstones. The throne room, once the center of the universe, stood quiet. The scent of incense had faded. Even the air, it seemed, had grown tired. And then came the knock at the gate. General Phoenician, known as the Christian General, had seized Beijing in a sudden coup. He was no monarchist, no romantic. He looked upon the Qing relics with the eyes of a man born in the Republic. A man of steel, not ceremony. And he made a simple decision. The last emperor would go. An edict was issued, not with reverence, but with finality. The agreement that had allowed Puyi to live in the palace was revoked. He had 24 hours to leave. It was raining that day. Not heavily, but enough to soften the ground and muffle the wheels of the carts that arrived to carry the former emperor's possessions, his books, his robes, his keepsakes from a life lived in dreamlight. Puyi, now 18, stood at the gates dressed in Western clothes. His glasses fogged. His mouth set in a line that trembled at the edges. He did not weep. But he did not speak either. He had never lived beyond these walls. And now, he was being cast out. He walked through the Meridian Gate one last time, not as emperor, not as exile, but as something in between. Something history did not yet have a word for. His household followed in silence. Servants who had once bowed low now carried boxes in the rain. The people watched. Some in curiosity. Some in pity. A few in contempt. Behind him, the red walls of the Forbidden City stood still. Silent witnesses to his departure. To the end of something older than memory. He moved into a residence just beyond the palace grounds, in the Japanese-controlled legation quarter. It was comfortable, modern, but it was not home. He walked its rooms like a ghost adjusting to life among the living. He began to write his memoirs. He wrote not in brushstrokes, but on a Western typewriter. Sentence by sentence, he unraveled the tangle of a life born in ceremony and ended in exile. He wrote of the robes, the bells, the rituals. He wrote of eunuchs, of loneliness, of rage. And always, beneath the lion's sorrow. He did not understand the world he had entered. And the world had no place for the emperor of a vanished age. Still, he tried. He studied more languages. Met diplomats. Maintained a small retinue who still called him, Your Majesty, though the title now rang hollow. And always, he dreamed of return. He believed, perhaps foolishly, that he could reclaim his throne. Not in Beijing, but in the northeast. In Manchuria, his ancestral homeland. And then, in 1931, the Japanese invaded Manchuria. They needed a puppet. A symbol. A face. And Puyi, orphaned by history, was ready to become one. And so, as the gates close behind him for the final time, and the rain soaks the crimson walls of the Forbidden City, the boy who once ruled the Middle Kingdom prepares to wear a crown once more. But not of his own making. The land was cold. Northern winds rolled across Manchuria, flattening grasses and bending trees as if they, too, were bowing before some invisible empire. And in 1932, beneath that grey sky, a familiar figure arrived. A man of slender build, dressed in foreign suits, with spectacles perched low on his nose, nervous, hesitant, always looking behind him. Puyi. He had come not as an emperor, not even as a citizen of China, but as a guest of Japan, a guest with a purpose. The Japanese military had invaded Manchuria under the pretense of liberation, but what they truly wanted was control: railways, factories, borders. And to give their new state of Manchukuo an air of legitimacy, they needed a figurehead. Who better than the last emperor of China? To the world, it would look like a revival. The Qin, reborn in the northeast. To the Japanese, it would be a masterstroke of optics. To Pai, it was hope. Hope that the world might need an emperor again. He accepted. And so, dear dreamer, in March 1932, Pai became the chief executive of Manchukuo. Not an emperor yet. A careful title. A transitional role. The illusion of sovereignty. But in truth, the strings had already been tied. His residence was grand, but sterile. His officials were Japanese. His guards were Japanese. Every document he signed had been prepared for him. Every speech reviewed. His movements monitored. His phone tapped. He had a throne, yes, but it sat atop a stage. Still, he played the role. He wore the uniform. He appeared in parades, received delegations, signed edicts written in another language. He held court with ministers who bowed low, even as they reported to Tokyo. He was treated like a monarch, but spoken to like a child. The Japanese called him the Kodai, Emperor, in 1934, raising him finally to the title he had lost in Beijing. There was a new anthem, new coins, new banners. But behind the ceremony was machinery he did not control. And yet, he convinced himself. Perhaps this was destiny. Perhaps Manchukuo was his second chance. Perhaps the people still needed him. But the people did not see him. To them, he was a distant symbol, a flickering image on a poster. Few in Manchuria believed in the dream of Manchukuo. Many saw it for what it was, a colony dressed in royal robes. Resistance simmered. Assassination attempts came, once with a bomb hidden in a bouquet of flowers. Pai's paranoia grew. He dismissed staff, replaced guards, slept poorly. He began to question everyone, even himself. And the Japanese were always watching. The Guandan army controlled every aspect of life in Manchukuo. They made decisions, set policies, managed schools and factories. When Pai protested, he was reminded, gently at first, then more firmly, that he reigned only by their grace. And yet he stayed. Not because he believed in the cause, but because he had nowhere else to go. He had been emperor. He had been exiled. And now, he was something else entirely. A puppet king, in a palace of ice and mirrors. And so, as the winds howl over the frozen fields of the northeast, and the banners of empire flap with hollow pride, the boy who was once son of heaven sits on a throne built by others. And waits. The years passed. The world burned. From 1937 onward, China was plunged once more into full-scale war. The Japanese invasion had spread beyond Manchuria. Cities fell. Villages vanished. Rivers ran with grief. And throughout it all, the man once known as the Son of Heaven sat alone in his puppet court in Changchun, the capital of Manchukuo, watching history unfold from behind silk curtains. Pai signed proclamations he did not write. He met ambassadors he did not choose. He appeared in parades he did not believe in. And yet, there he was, the emperor of a state recognized only by Japan and a handful of her allies. The people no longer looked to him. The ministers no longer listened. His signature had become a formality. His crown a shadow. He lived in quiet fear. The walls of his palace grew higher. His guards more numerous. His eyes more anxious. Every noise became a potential threat. He trusted few. He spoke less. His family, including his Empress Rome, lived nearby, but not closely. Her life had become one of tragic solitude. She had once been a bright girl from a noble family, elegant, witty, hopeful. But years in Manchukuo, under the strain of being an empress with no court, no power, no husband's love, had broken something in her. She turned to opium. She faded. Her laughter disappeared into the silk screens of her chambers, never to return. Huai too shrank, not in height, but in spirit. He no longer dreamed of being emperor. He no longer dreamed at all. And then, in 1945, came the reckoning. Japan surrendered. The atomic bombs fell. The empire of the rising sun, which had seemed so absolute, dissolved like paper in the rain. And with it, Manchukuo. The Soviet Red Army poured into Manchuria with a speed and ferocity that shocked even the Japanese. Huai's protectors vanished. His generals surrendered. His court disbanded overnight. He tried to flee. There is something painfully human in that final scene. Huai, once worshipped by millions, once adorned in golden robes, now stumbling through an airfield in civilian clothes, clutching a suitcase, desperately hoping for an airplane that might carry him to Tokyo. But the plane never took off. He was captured by the Soviets. The man who had once ruled the Middle Kingdom, who had worn dragon robes and received kowtows in the Hall of Supreme Harmony, was now a prisoner in Manchuria, sitting in a wooden chair in front of Soviet interrogators. He did not resist. There was nothing left to defend. They put him on a train to Siberia. In that cold, foreign land, he was no longer emperor, no longer puppet, not even a man of importance. Just a name on a manifest. A historical footnote wrapped in overcoat and uncertainty. He lived in a prison camp. He shoveled snow. He ate bread and cabbage. He wrote. He read. He waited. For years, the world forgot him. And yet, somewhere in the dim corridors of his memory, the palace still lingered. The red walls, the yellow tiles, the silent eunuchs, the scent of plum blossoms in the courtyard. Once, he had ruled all under heaven. Now, he watched frost gather on the windows of a barracks far from home. And so, as the war ends and the old world finally slips beneath the waves of history, we close another chapter in this long, drifting tale of a boy caught between ages, and an empress who once held the empire in her palm. The snow melted slowly in Siberia, and so did the identity of the man once called the Son of Heaven. Huai had lived 5 years in Soviet captivity. Years of silence, grey skies, and wooden bunks. He was not tortured, but he was watched, questioned, studied, and perhaps, in his solitude, for the first time in his life, he studied himself. The war was over, the empires were gone, and China was changing again. In 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. A new world ruled not by emperors or generals, but by ideology. The old dynasties were now considered feudal ghosts, relics to be swept away by the brooms of revolution. And what then to do with Huai? The Soviets, ever pragmatic, returned him to China in 1950. Not to the Forbidden City, but to Fushan War Criminals Management Center, a Reformation prison in northeastern China. Not a cell, but a classroom of iron and concrete. A place not to punish, but to remake. Huai was not alone. Dozens of former officials, generals, collaborators were imprisoned with him. They attended lectures, wrote confessions, cleaned floors, read mocks, participated in struggle sessions, where they recited their sins and were corrected by the state. It was not cruelty. It was something colder, transformation. Pai, for once, did not resist. There was nothing left of his old pride. No court. No throne. No name that could protect him. He folded his hands and listened. He wrote his own past in longhand, how he had allowed himself to be used, how he had abandoned his people, how the emperors, even before him, had failed. He became a model prisoner. He grew vegetables, washed dishes, read newspapers. He showed genuine remorse. Or perhaps it was resignation, or both. Either way, the state was satisfied. And in 1959, after nearly a decade behind those barbed walls, he was pardoned. A formal document, a signature, a ceremony. He bowed deeply before the red flag of the People's Republic. The Son of Heaven, now 63, walked free into a nation that no longer knew what to do with him. Beijing was not the city he remembered. Gone were the sedan chairs and sandalwood smoke. In their place, bicycles, loudspeakers, work units. The red walls of the Forbidden City still stood, but now they held a museum. And why? He became a gardener. He worked at the Beijing Botanical Gardens, trimming hedges and planting trees. He wore a gray mouse suit, carried a lunch tin, took the bus like everyone else. Sometimes, visitors would recognize him and stare. He would smile shyly and look down. He married again, quietly this time. A nurse. They lived in a modest apartment. No throne, no courtiers, just a kettle and a bookshelf. He wrote his memoirs. Not in purple prose, but in plain Mandarin. He titled it simply, From Emperor to Citizen. He died in 1967 of kidney cancer. His ashes were placed in a cemetery far from the palaces of his youth. And that, dear dreamer, was the final breath of the Qing. Not with a rebellion, not with a cry, but with a man quietly planting flowers in a republic built on the ruins of his reign. And so, as the last leaf falls from the tree of empire, and the silence deepens over the marble halls of the Forbidden City, our tale shifts once more, from the end, back to the woman who had begun it all. For though the emperor is gone, her shadow still stretches across the centuries. And now, dear dreamer, the woman at the center of it all. Long after her death, long after the last emperor folded his robes and vanished into gray, the name of Empress Dowager Cixi remained suspended in the air, like a whisper no wind could carry away. She had ruled from behind a silk curtain for nearly half a century, guided a dying empire through rebellion, reform, war, and collapse. But what remained of her when the last court bowed, when the last dragon banner fell? History, ever fickle, was not kind to her at first. In the early days of the Republic, she was blamed for everything. The collapse of the Qing, the failure of reform, the Boxer Rebellion, the corruption of the court. She was painted as a tyrant, a schemer, a dragon lady who ruled with cruelty and arrogance. Western writers made her into a caricature, an exotic villain draped in jewels, sipping poison tea while empires crumbled. But history softens over time. And as the decades passed, scholars began to look again, not with reverence, but with curiosity. They sifted through memorials, edicts, letters, paintings. They found not just a ruthless ruler, but a complicated woman caught in a collapsing world. She had risen from concubine to empress without ever holding official rank. She had governed a vast empire while forbidden to speak openly in court. She had outlived rebellions, foreign invasions, betrayal, and grief. She had buried a husband, buried a son, buried a dynasty, and still she ruled. Not perfectly, not always wisely, but with endurance, and a vision shaped not by ideology, but by necessity. She preserved what could be preserved. changed what had to be changed. And when she could no longer hold back the tide, she stepped aside. In her final years, as we saw, she had embraced reforms once unthinkable. She began the process that would eventually abolish the imperial exam system. She laid the groundwork for a constitution. She allowed railroads, universities, foreign advisors. She even commissioned portraits of herself in Western dress, a symbol not of surrender, but of adaptation. She was not a revolutionary, but she was not the reactionary villain that myth had made her either. She was a survivor, and more than that, a guardian. Of tradition, yes, but also of a country in chaos. Today, if you walk through the Summer Palace in Beijing, you will find her everywhere. In the stone boat on the lake, where she once sipped tea while officials begged for budgets. In the marble corridors of the Hall of Happiness and Longevity, where she held court beneath painted dragons. In the quiet path along the Longevity Hill, where she once walked alone at dusk, her thoughts hidden beneath layers of brocade and memory. She was not always loved, but she was unforgettable. Even now, as China walks its future beneath neon skies and concrete towers, the stories still linger, of the concubine who became queen in everything but name, of the mother who ruled through loss, of the woman who held the empire's breath as it faded. And so, as the stars settle gently over the roofs of the Forbidden City, and the moonlight traces the silhouette of a vanished crown, we remember her not as a monster, but as a mirror, reflecting the age she came from, and the one she never quite reached. Before the city awoke, before the roosters crowed from rooftops, and the cooks lit their morning fires, a single bell rang deep within the Forbidden City. It was not loud, not sharp. It was soft, like a chime hidden beneath silk. But to those who served within the crimson walls, it meant one thing. The Empress Dowager was awake. Her mornings began in darkness. In the hall of benevolent tranquility, beneath painted rafters of gold and blue, Cixi lay beneath embroidered quilts filled with goose down. Her dreams, if they came, were rarely remembered. Sleep was never her kingdom. It was a temporary ceasefire. Her mind woke as her body did, swiftly, silently, and without hesitation. She was always up before the sun. First came the attendants. Silent as snow, they entered on padded slippers, never looking her directly in the eyes. One would take her pulse. Another prepared warm water, steeped with dried jujube and ginseng. Another laid out her robes, perfectly arranged on an intricately carved wooden screen. She bathed in hot water scented with osmanthus blossoms, not for indulgence, but for purification. Even in her later years, Cixi followed the strict courtly rites. Cleanliness was not a luxury, it was discipline. As she sat in her wooden tub, steam rising in curls around her, her thoughts were already reaching the day ahead. By the time the eastern sky began to pale, she was seated at her dressing table. It was a small ritual, but a significant one. A court lady brushed her hair, slowly, precisely, 100 strokes. Then came the ornaments, phoenix combs, pearl pins, gold filigree shaped like plum blossoms or bats, each with symbolic meaning. Her makeup was light but deliberate, a touch of powder, a trace of vermilion on her lips, a dot of rouge at each cheek's hollow. She was not dressing for vanity. She was dressing for war. And then came the robes. Layer after layer of silk embroidered with dragons, clouds, cranes, chrysanthemums. Each motif was chosen for the occasion. White for mourning, yellow for court, blue for diplomatic meetings, lavender for private audiences. She wore them not as clothing, but as armor. By the time the first sunbeams broke over the city-styled roofs, she was already seated before a table of pale sandalwood, reviewing the day's memorials. Rolled scrolls bound in red thread. Bamboo tubes with secret reports. Western telegrams translated into courtly Mandarin. She read them all with the patience of a calligrapher. Each character mattered, each tone a clue. She ate breakfast in silence. Lotus porridge, steamed buns filled with sesame, slices of fruit arranged like petals. She ate sparingly. Always the same dishes. She believed rich food dulled the mind. Her favorite drink was warm almond milk, lightly sweetened. Sometimes she sipped jasmine tea. Never hurried. Never idle. Then, the audience began. At the Hall of Mental Cultivation, she sat behind a yellow silk screen, the dragon emblem above her, a lacquered table before her. Courtiers entered in order of rank, prostrated themselves, and delivered their reports. Cixi responded in a low, melodic voice, never rising, never faltering. She asked sharp questions. She remembered details others forgot. She never shouted. She did not need to. Behind the screen, her silence was a thunderclap. She issued decisions on floods, rebellions, trade missions, foreign treaties. She adjusted taxes, reassigned governors, ordered temples to be rebuilt. She did not rule by decree alone, she ruled by presence. Her word became the architecture of the day. And then, after the court dispersed, she returned to herself. She would walk in the gardens, alone often. Her slippers brushed against stone paths as she passed plum trees and peonies. She sometimes paused at the koi pond, feeding them crumbs from her sleeve. Here, away from the clamor of empire, she was not Cixi the Empress Dowager. She was a woman who had loved, lost, survived. She would paint. Tiny birds on thin branches. Orchids caught in the rain. Bamboo bending to the wind. Her brushwork was delicate, controlled, full of restraint. She once said, "A ruler's heart should be like the white spaces in a painting, calm, empty, and necessary." And in the quiet of her afternoon, she read poetry. Not just of the ancients, but of her youth. She loved the Tang poets, their longing, their quiet despair. She memorized lines like prayers. They did not speak of power. They spoke of fleetingness, of beauty slipping between fingers. She understood that. Dinner was more lavish, but only in appearance. She dined alone. A dozen dishes were brought in: bird's nest soup, shark fin, steamed fish, lotus root and honey. She tasted each, rarely finishing any. Food was a ritual, not a joy. And as night fell, she returned once more to scrolls and silence. The city outside the walls slept. But she did not. By candlelight, she read the final reports of the day. Sometimes she wrote letters, carefully phrased, never sentimental. Sometimes she sat in silence, watching the candle flicker, thinking of her son, of Guanqiu, of the dreams that had broken like teacups on marble. And when the candle finally burned low, she lay back beneath her embroidered covers. Not to rest, but to wait. Because even in sleep, the empire whispered to her. And so, as the stars turned slowly above the ancient capital, and the red walls hold in another night of secrets, we leave her there, still listening, still watching, still waiting behind the curtain. Behind every breath she took, dear dreamer, someone stood just out of sight, watching, waiting, listening. Her life, though cloaked in silk and ceremony, was never lived alone. It was lived, surrounded. Not by friends, not by equals, but by the shadows of power. Let us walk quietly now through the hidden world of those who served her, the eunuchs, attendants, and ladies in waiting who wove the unseen fabric of her daily life. The forbidden city, vast and unyielding, was populated not only by emperors and ministers but by thousands of those whose names would never reach the records. The palace women and the castrated men who kept the palace breathing. They rose before she did. Some washed floors with hands that cracked in winter. Others prepared her brushes and inkstones with a reverence usually reserved for altars. Still others folded her robes, arranged her hairpins, or arranged flowers in the exact pattern that she liked. Everything was ritual. Everything was memory. For Cixi, there was no such thing as a casual relationship. Everyone had a place. Everyone was a piece of the machinery. But some few, rose quietly above the rest. Lilianing, her chief eunuch, was one such figure. A man who bowed lower than anyone else, and whispered more deeply than any minister. He had served her for decades. Short, fastidious, always dressed in grey, his face often unreadable. He could anticipate her moods. He knew how she liked her tea steeped, how her brushstrokes flowed, what tone of voice soothed her after bad news. Some said he wielded immense power, that nothing reached the Empress Dowager's ears without first passing through his, that even high officials had to curry his favor, that he held secrets of the court locked behind his careful smiles. Perhaps he did. But loyalty, in Cixi's world, was a rare flower. She rewarded it when it bloomed, and cut it down when it withered. There were others too, palace women who had come to serve her as girls and stayed into old age. They rarely spoke above a whisper. They moved like drifting silk. They braided her hair, embroidered her shoes, recited poetry during sleepless nights. One, known only in records as Yuqin, once saved her from an accidental fire in her dressing chamber. She bore the scar for life. Cixi gave her a jade hairpin that day and never forgot her name. These women formed a net, not of affection, but of familiarity. They knew her steps, her silences. They knew when she needed solitude and when she needed poetry. They did not question. They did not advise. But they held the empire together, thread by quiet thread. They were invisible, yet essential. And among them were also spies. The palace was not safe, even for Cixi. Some servants were loyal to rival princes. Others were bribed by foreign agents. Some whispered reports to distant ministers in the hope of escape or reward. And so, Cixi lived with the knowledge that every word spoken in private might find us not meant to hear it. She adapted. She kept her secrets layered. Her thoughts veiled in metaphor. She rarely spoke directly, preferring glances, gestures, and silences that said more than words. Those closest to her learned to read them. Those who couldn't, didn't last long. There were no equals in her court. Only instruments. Yet still, she was not cruel. When a maid once spilled oil on her robe and wept with fear, expecting punishment, Cixi simply said, "Even the moon is stained by passing clouds," and turned away. She understood power, but she understood fear too. Because once, long ago, she had been a girl in a silk dress, carrying tea to someone else's throne. And so, as we move through the hidden doors and quiet corridors of her world, let us pause to remember those who did not write history, but who carried it, day after day, on slippered feet and calloused hands. They held her life like water in cupped palms, and in return, she gave them silence and survival. And so, as the lanterns dim and the curtains fall, we close this chapter of unseen lives beneath the gaze of a woman who never walked alone. Not all of Cixi's power came from commands, dear dreamer. Some of it, perhaps the truest part, came from stillness. From long afternoons in lacquered chambers. From quiet brushstrokes. From ink and scrolls and the patient language of color. Because even as she rolled the dying breaths of a dynasty, Empress Dowager Cixi remained an artist. To lead was to endure. But to paint? That was to breathe. Her studio was nestled within the summer palace, near a quiet pavilion that overlooked the placid waters of Kunming Lake. A pair of cranes often circled above it in spring, and peonies bloomed wildly near its stone path. Few were allowed to enter. Fewer still were allowed to watch her work. But within that room, lined with silk, lit by soft daylight, she created a different world. The Empress Dowager's painting style was delicate, rooted in the literati tradition of China's greatest scholar artists, but with her own quiet inflections. She favored vertical scrolls, long, soft strokes, subjects drawn from nature, but never copied, always interpreted. Her favorite subject? The plum blossom. It is no coincidence, dear one. The plum blooms in winter, alone, amid frost and silence. It is not the boldest flower, but the bravest. It does not wait for warmth. It declares itself against the cold. And it was, in many ways, a mirror of her life. In the folds of her scrolls, the blossoms twisted in solitude, branches gnarled like old hands, flowers like whispers at the edge of forgetting. Sometimes she painted orchids too, bamboo in rain, cranes in flight. Occasionally, she would include a distant pavilion or moonlight falling on stone. But always, her brush spoke with restraint, as if afraid to say too much. And she wrote poems in the corners. Short verses, always 5 or 7 characters, sometimes copy from old masters, sometimes her own. They spoke of snow melting on rooftops, of dreams lost beneath willow trees, of the taste of bitter tea at dawn. She never signed them with her title. Just a seal, a red square, a mark both imperial and intensely private. Her paintings were not for exhibition. They were given only as gifts to favored officials, foreign dignitaries, or those who had served her loyally. Receiving one was like being given a glimpse into a part of her no one else could touch. And yet, painting was not her only art. She arranged flowers, not by chance, but with the precision of ritual. Peonies for majesty, lotus for purity, plum for endurance. Each vase, each stem, told a story. Foreign diplomats often remarked that a single arrangement in her receiving hall conveyed more than any speech. She also practiced embroidery. It calmed her. During long nights of waiting, for news, for decisions, for peace, she would sit with silk stretched between her fingers and stitch birds into fabric, petal by petal. Some pieces still survive today. If you look closely, you'll see her style. Delicate outlines, subtle colors, always balanced. Never excessive. Never boastful. In all things, she sought harmony. Not perfection. Not pride. But that old Confucian virtue, balance. It was her philosophy of power, too. Too much force, and you break the branch. Too much softness, and the wind uproots you. One must bend, then return. Like bamboo. Like ink that fades gently into paper. And so, as we step back from the soft rustle of scrolls and the quiet rustling of silken thread, we see her again, not as empress, not as dragon, but as a woman who carried 1,000 years of history on her shoulders, and still found time to trace a blossom in the winter light. Because even rulers, dear dreamer, need a moment of beauty to remind them they are still human. And so, as the brushes are washed and the paint dries beneath the moon, we turn the page once more. For all her power, for all her titles and her reach, there was one realm Empress Dowager Cixi could never truly command. The realm of the heart. Behind every decision, every decree, every carefully arranged flower vase, was a woman who had lived nearly her entire life surrounded by people, and yet, wrapped in solitude. The Forbidden City was not only a palace, dear dreamer, it was a fortress. And sometimes it was a cage. Cixi had known love once. or something near to it. As a concubine, she had entered the harem of the Xianfeng Emperor, a man not particularly remembered for warmth. Yet in their early years he had favored her. Not for her beauty alone, though she was striking, but for her wit. For the way she listened and responded. For the curiosity in her gaze, rare in a palace of practiced silence. When she bore him a son, Zichuan, the future Tongji Emperor, their bond deepened, if only briefly. For a time, she was not just a consort. She was the mother of the heir, the chosen, the future. But love in the imperial court is a fragile thing, other concubines whispered. Jealousies bloomed like mold in the shade. The empress, formerly ranked above her, viewed her rise with suspicion. And the emperor, ever burdened by court and crisis, soon grew distant. When he died, Cixi's rise truly began. But love quietly disappeared. She never remarried. That was unthinkable for a woman of her position. An Empress Dowager did not belong to herself. She belonged to the dynasty, to tradition. Her body, her time, her choices were offerings to the past. And yet she did not live without affection. She adored her son, the Tongji Emperor, with a mother's fire. But he grew into a young man pulled by temptations and weaknesses she could not steer. His death, so young, so wasteful, left a wound no crown could cover. Her bond with her adopted son, the Guangxu Emperor, was more complicated. She had raised him, molded him, rolled through him. But when he came of age and tried to rule for himself, their paths diverged. He saw her as a wall. She saw him as fragile. And in the end, their silence became louder than their words. She had friends of a kind. Ladies in waiting who shared tea with her. Eunuchs who stayed by her side for decades. Painters, poets, garden keepers. But never equals. Never companions. She could not confide in anyone without calculation. Trust in her world was a coin too rare to spend. In moments of reflection, those soft twilight hours when the corridors emptied and the city dimmed, she sometimes walked alone. Past the Hall of Union. Through the Pavilion of Purity. Past doors that had once opened to music and now opened to silence. And there, among the shadows and magnolias, she remembered her father, who had once recited poetry to her beneath the lantern. Her mother, who had kissed her hair when she first entered the palace. Her son, as a baby, clutching her finger with tiny hands. The man she might have loved if she had not worn the robes of history. She did not write about these things. She did not speak of them. But in her paintings, in her poetry, they live. Quiet lines about birds returning to empty nests. About frost on chrysanthemums. About a robe folded carefully and never worn again. See, she lived in a world that revered distance. And so she became distant. But never heartless. She cried sometimes in private. The attendants heard her. Once, on the anniversary of her son's death, she stayed up all night burning incense and feeding the koi in silence. The next morning, her eyes were rimmed red, but she said nothing. She never had a love story, not like those in the scrolls. But her life was not without love. It was simply love, held in check, like a river frozen beneath moonlight. And so, as the wind brushes the curtains in her silent room, and the moon glows faint over the rooftops of memory, we pause in reverence for the heart behind the throne. A woman, not just a ruler, lonely, but never alone. Let us now, dear dreamer, wander into the warm golden glow of another world, a world of clinking porcelain, fragrant steam, and pageantry disguised the supper. The imperial banquet. For Empress Dowager Cixi, food was never merely nourishment. It was symbolism, a display. a way of telling the empire who she was and what she wanted them to believe. Her private meals were modest, yes, sips of almond milk, steamed fish, fruits sliced thin. But her banquets? Ah, those were performances. Imagine it. A long hall lined with silk banners, lanterns swaying gently with the breath of summer or the hush of snow. Musicians playing the soft tones of the guzheng, their fingers dancing along ancient strings. And at the center, a low table carved from fragrant rosewood, lacquered to reflect the candlelight like still water. Cixi sits alone at the head. To her left and right, rows of ministers, courtiers, visiting nobles, or, on occasion, foreign diplomats. They sit upright, respectful, their eyes trained not on the empress herself, but on the protocols that surround her like an invisible fence. And then the procession begins. Dozens, sometimes over 100, dishes arrive in careful sequence, each prepared by chefs trained not just in cuisine, but in court psychology. A duck lacquered to perfection, arranged with chrysanthemum petals. Shark fin, simmered in golden broth and served in porcelain shaped like lotus buds. Glutinous rice pearls floating in rose syrup, dusted with gold leaf. And always, symbolism. Turtle soup for longevity. Fish for abundance. Bamboo shoots for virtue. Even the number of courses mattered, never four, for its association with death, always in 8s and 9s, the numbers of emperors in eternity. Cixi did not eat everything, of course. She would lift her chopsticks slowly, tasting only what pleased her, just enough to signal favor. The untouched dishes? Still considered honored. Their presentation had spoken for them. She preferred delicate flavors, mild sweetness, little oil. She had no appetite for extravagance on her tongue, only in her eyes. Beauty mattered. Symmetry. Texture. A plate that was not arranged with precision could be dismissed with a glance. And though she rarely spoke during the feast, she watched everything. She observed who tasted what, who whispered to whom, whose chopsticks trembled slightly under pressure. She saw it all. Banquets to her were not just meals. They were diagnostics. A silent scan of the empire's pulse. And then, as the dishes were cleared, came the tea. Not just any tea. A blend prepared by her personal attendants, silver needle white tea with osmanthus, or jasmine tea poured over snow-chilled cups. She sipped with a stillness that made others forget to breathe. Sometimes, there would be entertainment. An opera singer from Suzhou, a dancer from the southern provinces, acrobats balancing plates as they twirled between the silk pillars. Cixi would watch, her expression unreadable, her fingers gently tapping her teacup in rhythm with the ancient melodies. And when the final bell rang, and the final bow was given, the guests would retreat, sated, overwhelmed, unsure whether they had dined or been measured. Because that was the truth. A banquet at court was never simply food. It was a statement, a test, a mirror, and she, the Empress Dowager, was always in control of the reflection. In her later years, the banquets became smaller, quieter, but never careless. She still chose the menu, still tasted the tea, still sat beneath the painted dragons and listened as a young girl played the flute, her notes rising like incense toward the vaulted ceiling. In those moments, one could almost forget the empire was dying, that the world outside the red walls was cracking. Inside, all was ceremony, all was balance. And so, as the candles burn low and the scent of lotus root fades into the night, we leave the table, step gently into the corridor, and remember, even a meal, when prepared by Cixi, could become history. Not all thrones are gilded. Not all councils held within walls. Sometimes, dear dreamer, power walks in gardens. For Empress Dowager Cixi, The garden was not only a place of reflection, it was a second court. A quieter one. One that did not bow or flatter, but simply breathed. The summer palace, northwest of Beijing, was her sanctuary. Not the original, mind you. The old palace, once the retreat of earlier emperors, had been burned by Anglo-French forces during the Second Opium War. Its ashes were a scar Cixi never forgot. And when she returned, she did not merely rebuild it. She remade it. Kunming Lake was dredged and reshaped. The longevity hill rebuilt, stone by stone. Corridors painted, pavilions restored. Every willow planted, every stone placed, every bridge aligned, not at random, but with purpose. The garden itself became a kind of poem. And in its lines, Cixi walked. Each morning, after court or ceremony, she would stroll slowly through the covered long corridor. It stretched over 700 meters, lined with 14,000 painted panels, each telling a story from Chinese myth or history. She knew them all. She had chosen many herself. Beneath these scenes, she would walk with hands clasped behind her back, attendants a respectful distance away. The emperors of old whispered from the rafters. The mountains watched in stillness. And always, Kunming Lake shimmered beside her, calm, but never passive. She often paused near the marble boat. A strange, beautiful structure, a boat that could not sail, carved from stone, anchored forever in place. It was said to symbolize the dynasty, strong, eternal, unable to capsize. And yet, unmoving. Some whispered she used funds meant for the navy to build it. Others said it was built to remind her of what she'd lost, the real ships, the real battles. Perhaps both were true. Cixi never explained it. She simply gazed upon it, eyes unreadable. Her favorite spot was a small pavilion nestled among peonies near the hill's base. There, with brush and scroll, she would paint. Birds. Blossoms. Bamboo. Her thoughts grew still. Her attendants kept watch. Her ministers stayed away. Only there, perhaps, did she feel unguarded. The garden paths were more than pleasure, they were strategy. A space to host foreign envoys away from the formality of court. To test their manners. To speak not of treaties, but of trees. It was in those spaces that her diplomacy flowered, not through orders, but observation. She noticed who paused at which statue, who asked about the koi, who understood the story behind a carving. In her world, intellect was often revealed in silence. Sometimes, at dusk, she would walk alone. The lanterns glowed softly beneath the eaves. The water grew still. The sky turned lavender above the tiled rooftops. And in those moments, she was no longer empress, nor widow, nor ruler of crumbling walls. She was simply a woman walking through memory. The stones remembered. The trees, silent sentinels, bowed as she passed. The wind, gentle, cool, braided her hair in secret. And when she returned to her chambers, the scent of chrysanthemums clung to her sleeves. Gardens, dear dreamer, are where empires go to breathe, to remember, to endure. And so, as we leave the whispering corridors and lotus French waters behind, let us carry with us one final image. A woman in twilight robes, walking softly through a painted world she built, stone by stone, story by story. Not all power lies in decrees, dear dreamer. Sometimes, it rests in pages. Tucked behind painted screens and bamboo blinds, Empress Dowager Cixi kept a private library, an unassuming chamber within the forbidden city where no officials entered without invitation. There, among silk-bound volumes and ink-stained scrolls, she read. It was not widely known, and it was never discussed in court. But she, like the emperors before her, held a scholar's reverence for the written word. Her collection was modest by imperial standards. The Qing had maintained enormous archives, tens of thousands of books, curated by generations of librarians and scholars. But this room was hers alone, personal, curated not for posterity, but for reflection. The shelves bore the classics, of course, the Analects, the Book of Changes, the records of the Grand Historian, works she had studied since girlhood. Their lessons had shaped her hand, her voice, her instincts. But among them, more intimate volumes lived. She read poetry, not merely for beauty, but for recognition. Li Qingzhao, the song Dynasty poetess, was a favorite, her verses filled with longing, restraint, and subtle grief. Cixi saw herself in those lines, in the space between what is said and what must be left unsaid. She read history, obsessively, the rise and fall of dynasties, the rebellions that shattered courts, the generals who turned against the emperors they served. She knew every failed regency, every usurper. She read not with curiosity, but with strategy. Know the patterns, she once told a court lady. The river of history always wins, but its bends are familiar. And she read, when she dared, foreign works, translated by cautious officials or curious merchants. They came into her hands under careful titles, essays on European diplomacy, medical texts, even reports on railroads and constitutions. She did not always trust them, but she read them. Slowly, repeatedly. She read with a scholar's attention. Margins filled with notes. Pages marked with silk ribbons. Sometimes she copied passages into her own journal, translated them into Chinese verse, blending East with West until the line blurred. There was one book she kept hidden, a journal written by an English missionary woman, a gift, perhaps, or a relic from a foreign visit. Its pages were filled with descriptions of China through foreign eyes, the streets of Guangzhou, the temples of Hangzhou, the court at a distance. Cixi read it not with anger, but with wonder. What do they see when they look at us? She once whispered aloud. No one answered. But the question lingered. In the center of the room stood her reading table. Always tidy, always prepared. A ceramic brush washer shaped like a crane. A weight of carved jade. Fresh sheets of rice paper. Inkstone worn smooth by years of use. She wrote there. Not proclamations, but thoughts. Letters never sent. Ideas never shared. Notes to herself. Reflections on policy. Doubts, fears, hopes, all spelled out in the quiet black thread of her handwriting. Some of these pages remain today, preserved, studied, and when read aloud, they do not sound like the voice of a tyrant. They sound like a woman trying to hold back the tide of change, with words. In the evenings, she often read by candlelight, alone, the halls hushed, the city sleeping. Only the scratch of brush on paper, the flicker of flame, the whisper of turning pages. And when she was done, she would sit for a long while, eyes closed, listening, as if the scrolls themselves might answer. They never did. But she returned each night, just the same. Because in those pages, she did not need a court. She did not need a crown. She only needed silence, and the company of minds who, though long dead, spoke to her still. And so, as the lamp dims and the pages fall quiet, we leave her there, a solitary figure in a room of ancient stories, adding her own. The forbidden city was built to be impenetrable. Its walls were thick, its gates heavy, its symmetry divine. Everything within it whispered of permanence, order, control. But the world, dear dreamer, does not respect walls. And one by one, the winds of the outside began to creep beneath the palace eaves. It began with ships, dark silhouettes on the eastern sea. British, French, Russian, German, all bearing flags no emperor had ever bowed to. Their sails moved not with wind, but with steam. Their hulls carried not tribute, but demands. And so came the unequal treaties, a name that history gave with bitter clarity. Cixi, still young in power, read them with tight lips. Pages filled with concessions, ports opened, tariffs set by others, territories leased for 99 years, missionaries protected by foreign law. It was not diplomacy. It was quiet surrender. She hated them. But she signed them. Not out of weakness, but calculation. The Qin armies, plagued by outdated weapons and infighting generals, could not stand against the West. Better to yield now, she thought, and rebuild in silence. Still, the shame stung. She saw foreign soldiers march through Chinese streets. She saw temples desecrated. She saw Western advisors dine in buildings once reserved for mandarins. She ordered that they be watched. She made them bow, even slightly, before audiences. But she could not remove them. She tried to modernize the army. She sent inspectors to Japan, to Germany. She commissioned new rifles, new uniforms. But reforms moved slowly, choked by conservative factions and palace intrigue. Every step forward was contested by those who clung to robes of vanished glory. The foreign pressure was constant. In the north, Russia crept downward with its Trans-Siberian Railway. In the south, Britain expanded its hold on Hong Kong. France carved pieces from the southwest. Even tiny Belgium negotiated railroad rights in provinces they had never seen. And always, the missionaries. Some came in peace. Others came with condescension. They built schools, hospitals. But they also tore down shrines, converted the poor, offended the literati. And in the countryside, resentment simmered. This storm would one day break into the Boxer Rebellion. But long before that, Cixi had to navigate a daily storm of diplomacy. Foreign ministers met her with practiced smiles and veiled contempt. They mispronounced her titles, brought clocks as gifts, never realizing they symbolized death in Chinese tradition. Some tried to charm her. Others threatened her. None truly understood her. She answered them with grace. Always grace. She wore dragon robes. She spoke in poetry. She issued proclamations that balanced the ancient and the immediate. And privately she seethed. She once told her chief eunuch, "They bring their maps as if we are a space to be colored in. But we are a history they cannot read." And yet she did not deny their usefulness. She learned from them. She observed how they governed, how they built railways and telegraphs, how they trained their armies and managed their banks. She understood that survival meant adaptation, even if it tasted of defeat. It was not admiration. It was necessity. She welcomed Western doctors to the palace. She installed electric lights in select halls. She ordered foreign music to be played at court festivals, but always with control, always on her terms. And late at night, she would walk the quiet corridors and wonder, how much longer could she hold the center? The silk roof still gleamed in the sun. The marble floors still echoed with formality. But beyond the gates, the future was knocking. And so, as the wind rises and the banners flutter against an uncertain sky, we leave her standing beneath a carved lintel, her gaze steady, her hands clasped, not in prayer, but in defiance. The dragon sleeps, yes, but she still listens. There is a room, dear dreamer, deep within the forbidden city, where the walls shine like water. It is lined not with scrolls or stone carvings, but with mirrors. Silvered European mirrors. They arrived one winter, brought in heavy crates by foreign emissaries. Gifted respectfully, from the court of Queen Victoria to the court of the Empress Dowager. A gesture of diplomacy, of recognition. and perhaps of subtle comparison. Cixi accepted them with a smile. She had never feared reflection. In fact, she studied it. The room became known quietly as the mirror hole, and though it was never on official maps, it existed, tucked near the hall of mental cultivation, a chamber where she examined not only her image, but the gaze of others. Because by then, the foreign gaze had become relentless. Cixi had become a figure of global fascination. Cartoonists in London drew her as a dragon with silk sleeves. Newspapers in Paris called her the woman who rolled through whispers. American headlines compared her to Cleopatra. Some saw her as a cunning tyrant. Others, a tragic holdover from a vanished age. None truly saw her. And so, in that mirrored room, she began to shape her image herself. She commissioned portraits. Not the traditional ink and brush scrolls of her ancestors, but oil paintings, Western style, with perspective and shadow. She sat for a court painter named Catherine Carl, an American woman whose brush captured not just Cixi's regalia, but her bearing. In one painting, she is seated on a carved throne, draped in embroidered silk, her gaze direct but unreadable. Surrounding her are peonies, jade cloisonné. Her hands rest lightly, but not idly. Her expression is neither a smile nor a scowl. It is intention. That portrait was later exhibited in St. Louis. Crowds came to see it, to stare into the painted eyes of the most powerful woman in Asia. They saw a monarch, a mystery, a myth. Cixi had seen it too, before it left the palace. She had stood before the canvas in the mirror hall and studied it not for vanity, but for accuracy. Did it convey the message she intended? Was the symbolism clear? Would it translate across oceans? She approved it with a single nod. That too was power. But her relationship with the foreign world was more than portraits. It was negotiation. Chess played with silken gloves. She hosted diplomats with grace, memorized their customs, corrected their translators when they fumbled her meanings. She knew the names of their children, their rivalries, their ambitions. She gave them rare tea, precious jades, poetry inscribed in gold leaf, and she made them wait, not out of insult, but assertion. In her palace, she remained the sun. Yet beneath this mastery, she understood the deeper truth. Their gaze shaped the narrative. Their newspapers could erode her image as easily as their soldiers had burned her gardens. She could not stop the tide, but she could pose for it. The mirror hall became her rehearsal space. There, she practiced speeches, reviewed translations, studied photographs brought in from abroad. She asked about French fashion, German politics, Russian winters. She did not long for the world, but she refused to be surprised by it. In one of her last winters, she walked the mirror room with her favorite silk fan, alone, save for her eunuch Li Lianing. The snow fell quietly beyond the lattice. She turned to him and said, "They believe I am old China, but even old mirrors reflect what is now. And so, as the lights of foreign ships gleam on distant waters, and the silvered surfaces hold the gaze of an empire fading into memory, we leave her there, still studying, still shaping, still refusing to be unseen." It did not come with thunder, dear dreamer. The fall of the Qing was not a blaze. It was an ember, glowing faintly behind heavy brocade curtains, waiting for the last breath to extinguish it. By the early 1900s, the signs were everywhere. The empire's borders had shrunk like a drying river. The court's coffers, once filled with silver, echoed with deficit. Officials bickered like aging scholars, and the people, the people, had begun to look elsewhere. To ideas, to republics, to revolution. And Cixi knew. She was not naive. She had outlasted too many betrayals to believe the dynasty could endure forever. She had seen the Boxer rebellion crushed, had watched her son, her chosen successor, fade into illness and confinement. She had read the reports from the provinces, uprisings, student groups, slogans painted in ink across ancient walls. She kept ruling, but she began preparing. She ordered more reforms in her final years than in the previous 30. She abolished the civil service exams, the cornerstone of Confucian order for 1,000 years. She approved constitutional drafts. She allowed for provincial assemblies. Too late, perhaps, but not without intent. In private, she wrote letters to princes, to generals, to the Dowager Court, pleading not with panic, but with precision. Protect the boy, she said. Let him learn the new ways. Keep the line, even if the throne must change its shape. But fate, as ever, moved faster than she could. In 1908, the Guangxu emperor died, officially from illness. But many believe, still, that he was silenced, quietly, so he would not rule after her death, so that no counter-order could be issued once she passed. Whether she commanded it or not, the timing was too precise. And the very next day, Cixi herself grew still. Her final hours were not public, not grand. She lay in her bed, pale and quiet, tended by silent attendants and weeping ladies. The long silk curtains were drawn. The incense was lit. Her lips moved occasionally, whispering names, perhaps, or verses. They say she looked at her hands, long and thin, and said, "So much done, so little changed." Her last order? That a 2-year-old boy, Puai, be named emperor. She left no speech, no memoir, no farewell. Only a sealed decree, and a whisper in the candlelight. And so, the woman who had ruled behind the throne for nearly half a century, departed, without ceremony, without sound. The court, ever proper, held rituals, drums, robes of mourning, lines of officials reciting praises. But they knew, as did the people in the alleys and the farmers in the fields, that something deeper had ended. The Empress Dowager had not merely died. The dynasty had lost its breath. In the months that followed, Puai would be crowned. But it was a coronation in name only. The boy could barely speak. The ministers bowed to an echo. The warlords gathered like vultures beyond the gates. And in 3 short years it would all vanish. But for now, as the sky dims over the red walls, as the palace lanterns sway in the winter wind, we linger a moment longer beside her still form, wrapped in brocade, surrounded by scrolls and silence. No throne, no crown, only memory. She was born in an empire that thought it would last forever, and she died, knowing it would not. There are some silences that even drums cannot fill. In the winter of 1908, the Forbidden City fell quiet, not the quiet of nightfall or meditation, but the hushed breath of morning. The Empress Dowager Cixi, the woman who had ruled China through whispers and war, was gone. But her departure was anything but small. For even in death, the ceremony was precise. Her body was washed in warm water scented with magnolia. Dressed in robes of midnight blue, embroidered with 9 golden dragons, each with 5 claws, each curling through clouds as if to carry her soul. On her fingers, jade rings. In her ears, long pearl drops that brushed her shoulders. Around her, ritual scrolls were read aloud. Prayers whispered in archaic Manchu. Seals pressed into yellow silk. And when it came time to move her, the funeral procession began, not with haste, but with ritualized grandeur. The coffin, lacquered, inlaid with gold and jade, was carried by 48 bearers. Each step timed to the beat of mourning drums. Along the wide avenue from the Forbidden City to the eastern Qing tombs, thousands lined the path, heads bowed, weeping not only for a woman, but for an era. Behind her came banners, embroidered with her titles and calligraphy so fine the brushstrokes looked like threads. Following them, endless lines of court officials, ladies-in-waiting, eunuchs, guards, all dressed in white, the color of imperial mourning. Even foreign dignitaries sent representatives. Though they had challenged her in life, they paid their respects in death. Because Empress Dowager Cixi had been more than a monarch. She had been the last great axis of the Qing. And the people, though worn, though bitter, understood. Her funeral took days. The rites were endless. Offerings burned by the cartful, silk, paper horses, scrolls, fake money, symbolic wealth for the afterlife. Priests chanted for hours without pause. At night, lanterns lined the mountain path, swaying in the wind like fireflies mourning a fallen star. Her final resting place was to be the Putua Dingdongaling, a tomb she had commissioned decades before, built deep into the hills, surrounded by carved dragons, stone lions, pavilions in the shape of lotus petals. Its construction had cost a fortune, but its purpose was clear: to preserve the image of permanence. She would be laid to rest near the empress she had served and outlived. When the coffin was lowered, bells tolled so slowly it felt as though time itself was bowing. Her attendants wept. Some collapsed. A few eunuchs whispered poems into the cold air, as if she could still hear. And then, the great stone door was sealed. And that, it seemed, was that. The Forbidden City continued, of course. Puyi, her hand-picked child emperor, would play his role for a few years more. But the fire had dimmed. The palace still echoed with court rituals, but without her presence, they felt rehearsed. Hollow. The empire had been held together not by armies, not by flags, but by the sheer force of her will. Now, the thread was cut. Within weeks, reformists gained ground. Revolutionaries grew louder. Soldiers hesitated at orders. And beyond the Great Wall, winds stirred that would soon sweep the Qing into the pages of history. But that day, as snow began to fall upon the golden rooftops of her resting place, the air held one last breath of ancient China. A breath scented with incense, dust, and fading jasmine. She had lived as a concubine, ruled as a sovereign, and died as a symbol. And in her final silence, the empire itself began to whisper goodbye. The palace, dear dreamer, did not crumble overnight. After Cixi's funeral pyres dimmed and her mourners returned to court, life within the Forbidden City seemed to carry on. Ceremonies continued, bells tolled, the yellow tiles still gleamed in the morning sun. But something beneath the surface shifted. The breath of power had left, and what remained was ritual without root. The boy emperor, Puyi, barely 3 years old, now sat on the dragon throne, or rather, was placed there. His feet did not yet reach the footstool. His voice, when he spoke, was softer than the rustle of silk. And the ministers, once so skilled in flattery, now bowed not to wisdom, but to a whisper of imperial memory. A regency council rolled in his name, but none could rule as she had. The palace became stranger. Some rooms were sealed, those closest to Cixi's personal chambers. Her fans still rested on their shelves. Her tea bowls still bore traces of jasmine. Servants spoke of her ghost, glimpsed in moonlight, walking alone through the hall of longevity. Others simply avoided those halls. The eunuchs who had once served her began to drift like leaves without wind. Some stayed, clinging to fading routines, lighting incense before an empty throne, folding robes no one would wear. Others slipped away, returning to families they had not seen in decades. A few, unable to live without their place in her world, ended their lives silently. And the palace children, yes, there were always children, played games among the relics. They tied yellow ribbons to stone lions. They slid down marble balustrades. They peeked into throne rooms and made up stories of dragons and queens. They did not know the gravity of the ground they played upon. The courtiers bickered. Reformists demanded more change. Conservatives begged for order. But none could find the balance she had once maintained. Cixi had ruled with paradox, a guardian of tradition who knew when to bend. Without her, the court tipped forward like a boat with no oars. Foreigners grew bolder. Newspapers speculated openly about the Qing's impending fall. Foreign legations sent cautious reports. One diplomat wrote, "The palace echoes now like a bell no one strikes." And outside the red walls, the world had moved on. Railways stretched toward the interior. Telephones rang in provincial capitals. Students abroad returned with books in their arms and revolution in their hearts. Newspapers printed in Mandarin and English sped daily. The people, many poor, many angry, asked aloud why emperors still reigned in silence. Inside, the boy emperor learned to write his name. He practiced calligraphy beside windows clouded with breath. He asked questions his tutors could not answer. He sat on a throne no longer feared. And sometimes, he wandered into her old garden. There, among the peonies, he would pause, watch the koi, touch the bark of the ancient plum tree. He did not remember her. But the garden did. The palace, without her, became a museum still pretending to breathe. Ministers carried out rituals with faces carved in wax. The drums still beat. The bells still rang. But the music was missing its conductor. Cixi had ruled not with perfection, but with presence. And now that presence was gone. And so, as the last lanterns flicker beneath the crimson eaves, and the palace echoes with the footsteps of ghosts and children, we feel it too, that delicate, inevitable ending. The dynasty had not yet fallen, but it had already passed. The dragon throne was taller than he was. Why, the boy chosen by Cixi in her final breath, had just turned 3 when the imperial crown was lowered, symbolically, above his brow. He did not understand what it meant. He did not understand that he was becoming the Xiantong emperor. He did not understand that the world he was being asked to rule was already slipping away. What he did understand was loneliness. Because the forbidden city, dear dreamer, was no place for a child. He was surrounded by protocol, not affection. His toys were carved from jade. His lessons were etched in formality. His caretakers, though gentle, were bound to codes that forbade play. He could not run. He could not shout. He could not speak without being summoned. The robes were too heavy. The crown pinched his scalp. The ministers who bowed before him scared him with their blank expressions and rehearsed prostrations. He missed his mother. She was nearby, technically, within the inner quarters. But even as empress, she was not allowed to mother him. Not directly. Not in ways that mattered. Her arms were not permitted to wrap around him in court. Her voice could not comfort him before the council. He was raised by tutors, eunuchs, and silence. He wept often. Once, in a fit of confusion, he asked, "Why don't they let me go home?" No one could answer. The days became long parades of rituals. Rise at dawn. Dress in silk. Read from the 4 books. Practice calligraphy. Sit still while ministers discussed affairs he did not understand. The only sound that soothed him was the clinking of wind chimes in the palace corridors. His playmates were his younger brother and a handful of selected cousins. But even their games were watched, structured, sanitized. They played beneath the same pavilions Cixi had once walked, their laughter echoing off dragon-painted walls that could not laugh back. The weight of empire, so light in theory for a child, pressed down. He watched birds in the garden and asked why they could fly beyond the walls. He watched cocks circle in the koi pond and asked if they ever grew tired of the same stone edges. No one ever said no. The officials around him carried fear like a scent. Not of him, but of what his reign represented. They knew the tide outside the walls. They knew the revolutionaries grew louder. They knew the palace stood on borrowed time. And so they clung to form. They made him recite edicts, bow before ancestral tablets, sit beneath portraits of emperors who had ruled when the world still trembled at the sight of the dragon banner. But Puyi was not a dragon. He was a boy in silk robes, scared of thunder, curious about sparrows, and longing for bedtime stories. Once, he snuck into Cixi's old garden. The peonies were in bloom. He sat by the stone bench where she had painted in her final years. There, beside a small pavilion, he found an old brush. He held it, dipped it in water, wrote his name on a flat stone. The water dried quickly. The name disappeared. It would take years before he understood what that meant. And so, as the sky above the forbidden city darkened once more and the stars blinked behind a veil of history, we leave the boy emperor in his silent palace, surrounded by riches starved of freedom, crowned, and completely alone. It began far from the palace, not in a council hall, not in the forbidden city, but in a dusty railway yard in Wuchang in the autumn of 1911. There, amid coal smoke and rusted metal, a group of soldiers mutinied. They raised a banner, fired shots into the night. And with that sound, so unlike the drums of court, the Xinhai Revolution began. At first, it seemed distant. To the officials within the red walls, Wuchang was a province, a report, a disturbance. There had been rebellions before, countless, and they had always been put down, but not this time. Within days, the uprising spread. Cities fell like leaves shaken by wind. One by one, Changsha, Nanjing, Shanghai, they declared independence from the Qing. Provinces turned into republics overnight. Officials defected. Armies hesitated. And the once mighty imperial government found itself without voice, without sword. In the forbidden city, the tension thickened. Whispers replaced orders. Eyes darted. No one knew who to trust. Some ministers began dressing in plain robes, preparing for escape. Others, the old conservatives, still clung to the hope that some miracle would restore order. A storm. A general. A ghost. Puyi, now 5 years old, was still dressing in yellow silk each morning. Still sitting on the throne. Still being told that he ruled. All under heaven. But outside, heaven had already cracked. By November, the revolutionaries had taken Nanjing. A new government was declared. And a name emerged, Sun Yat-sen. A man educated abroad, fluent in the language of republics, of rights, of change. He did not demand blood. He did not seek revenge. He simply called for an end. To monarchy. To dynastic rule. To the empire that had crowned infants and killed dreams for centuries. Back in Beijing, the court panicked. Some called for war. Others begged for negotiation. The Empress Dowager Cixi's niece, and the widow of the Guangxu emperor, now held regency for little Puyi. And it fell to her to decide. She was not Cixi. She was not a dragon behind a screen. She was a widow, frightened and weary. And when the revolutionaries sent envoys, offering peace in exchange for abdication, she listened. There would be no siege. No storming of the palace. No foreign rescue. Only this. The end. On February 12, 1912, the abdication edict was signed. The last emperor of China, aged 6, surrendered the mandate of heaven. There was no ceremony, no final audience, no farewell procession. Only a quiet moment in a high-ceilinged chamber, where officials knelt and wept, and the boy looked up from his desk and asked, "What does abdicate mean?" He would not understand for years. And yet, he felt it. The drums that once announced court sessions were silent. The bells that had rung for generations no longer echoed. The throne still stood. But it was just furniture now. Outside the red walls, firecrackers exploded in celebration of the new republic. Inside, a child removed his crown. And so ended an empire of over 2,000 years, not with swords or flames, but with a signature. A sigh. A child's question hanging in the still air. Dear dreamer, it is said that all things end. But few end so quietly, and so completely. The edict had been signed. The throne had fallen. And yet, the forbidden city did not empty. Not immediately. For a time, history paused. Under the terms of abdication, the boy Emperor Puyi was permitted to stay within the palace. He would retain his title, the Emperor of the Great Qin, in form only. He would live in the inner court, protected, respected, but no longer sovereign. The Republic had risen, but its newest citizen was still dressed in silk. And so, dear dreamer, a strange chapter began. A palace without an empire. From the outside, the forbidden city looked unchanged. The yellow tiles still gleamed. The guards still stood at their gates. The imperial standard still fluttered gently in the northern wind. But inside, time had softened. Ceremonies became optional. Court ministers stopped coming. Rituals were abbreviated, then forgotten. The great halls fell into silence. The clatter of palace life, the rustle of brocade, the shuffle of eunuchs, the slow chant of mantras, grew thin, like the last echoes of a melody. Puyi, now no longer emperor, still lived in its heart. He was allowed a small staff. Some eunuchs remained, those too old or too faithful to leave. His family joined him, his father, his mother, his younger brother. They ate simple meals now, cooked in modest stoves. No more banquets. No more offerings. The days blended into one another. The boy wandered. He explored the gardens, climbed the marble terraces, touched the golden urns that once held sacred fire. But they no longer sparked. They were only stone now. The throne room, once a chamber of all, became a place of games. He played hide and seek beneath the imperial canopy. His brother chased him through the hall of supreme harmony. In his child's mind, the past became a playground. And yet, even children feel the weight of ghosts. The eunuchs still addressed him as, "Your Majesty." They still bowed, still averted their eyes. But their numbers dwindled. Some found work outside. Others simply disappeared. One night, a former court official returned in secret. He knelt before the boy, now 8, and recited a poem in tears. He wept for the lost dynasty, for his ancestors, for Cixi, for the end of a world. The child watched in silence, holding a toy soldier given to him by a foreign visitor. When the man left, Puyi asked, "Why do they miss something I don't remember?" And the answer came not in words, but in stillness. Outside the palace, China changed rapidly. Railroads spread. Cities buzzed. Warlords carved the land into territories. The republic faltered. Civil war loomed. But behind the red walls, life stood still. A painting of yesterday, preserved but no longer alive. In time, Puyi began to read more. He studied Western books, practiced English, wrote diary entries. He asked questions the walls could not answer. Why had the empire fallen? Why had he been chosen, only to be forgotten? He began to resent the silence. He once wrote, "I was a living ghost, haunting the ruins of my own childhood." And so, the palace became both cradle and coffin, a place of endless corridors, empty halls, fading echoes, the last imperial phoenix, grounded in gilded solitude. And outside, the world no longer looked back. No drums, no messengers, no tribute, just the sound of wind brushing stone. And so, dear dreamer, we leave the palace there, still standing, still golden, but gently dissolving into memory. A kingdom without a crown, an emperor without an empire, a palace dreaming itself into sleep. She had never asked for a crown. Empress Dowager Cixi, widow of the Guangxu emperor and niece of Cixi, had lived most of her life in the shadow of greater voices. In Cixi's court, she was decorum, graceful, obedient, polite. Never the favorite. Never the storm. But in the end, dear dreamer, it was she who signed the final breath of an empire. Cixi was a quiet woman. Not timid. Not weak. But quiet. Her power was never in her tone. It was in her restraint. In her ability to endure humiliation without protest. To carry the dignity of an empire while watching it crumble in her hands like powdered jade. After Puyi's abdication, she remained in the palace for a while longer. She walked the inner court in slow steps, past the hollow thrones, past the gardens where Cixi once painted and plodded. She remembered the scent of incense before state rituals, the sound of bells before dawn, the weight of hairpins that meant the world was watching. Now, no one watched. The guards were fewer. The eunuchs no longer sang their morning greetings. The halls she had once entered with bowed head were now filled with sunlight and silence. She mourned Guangxu. They had never shared deep love, not in the romantic sense. But there had been an understanding, a shared loneliness. A bond born of being born too close to the throne, and yet, too far from its true power. His death had not been clean. She had not questioned the whispers. Poison, some said. A cup of arsenic-laced tea. A command that came too late to stop. Others said he had simply succumbed to sorrow, to sickness, to a life lived without agency. She had sat beside his body, dry-eyed, and whispered, "Now you may rest." She never spoke of it again. Now, as regent to a boy emperor who had never ruled, she signed the abdication not with protest, but with trembling fingers. She did it for peace, for preservation, for the hope that perhaps the court would be spared the chaos of open war. The revolutionaries had promised her that. They had promised a pension, respect, protection for the palace. And she, perhaps foolishly, believed them. But the promises faded like smoke in a paper lantern. Her health declined soon after. Stress, shame, a silent grief. She retreated to her own quarters and spent long afternoons in the imperial garden, a smaller one, tucked beside the palace of tranquil longevity. It was filled with plum trees, bamboo, and a pond in the shape of a crescent moon. She rarely spoke. She would sit on a stone bench beneath the largest tree, staring into the water, her hands folded in her lap. Sometimes she held a fan embroidered with peonies. Sometimes she carried a small prayer book. Once, an attendant heard her whisper to a koi fish, "We are both waiting for something that won't come." She died quietly in 1913. No fanfare. No grand tomb. Her funeral was simple, as per the Republic's uneasy arrangement. Her death was not widely mourned by the New World. But within the palace, a hush fell again. For she had been the last link. The final breath of Cixi's generation. The last to wear the dragon-stitched robe with authority. When her body was carried out, wrapped in white silk, even the birds seemed to fall silent. And so, dear dreamer, let us remember her not as a ruler, but as a keeper of endings. A woman who signed history's last sentence with a trembling hand, who tended the garden of a dying world with grace, and sorrow, and silence. Rest now, lone you. The throne is empty. The garden is still, and history has closed the gate. The last rites had been spoken. The court had fallen silent. And the Forbidden City, once the pulsing heart of the world's longest-running empire, became a palace of ghosts. But the story, dear dreamer, did not end there. For history, like incense smoke, curls onward, unseen, unresolved, never quite fading. In the years after abdication, the great red walls still stood. Tourists came, first nervously, then curiously, to see the relics of the vanished dynasty. They took photographs of the golden roof tiles, the dragon thrones, the empty halls where ministers once trembled under imperial gaze. The public began calling it a museum. But for the boy Emperor Hui, now an awkward young man, it was still home. He remained in the inner court, under a strange arrangement that let him live as a symbolic emperor while the world outside became a republic, then a battlefield, then something stranger still. He was both prisoner and prince, host and guest. He wrote in his journal, "I am the shell of a god no one believes in anymore." He tried to escape it. He left the palace briefly in 1924, banished by warlord Fulnucian, who marched soldiers into the Forbidden City and politely, but firmly, asked the last emperor to pack his things. Hui left through the gate of divine might with nothing but a suitcase, a western suit, and a face numb from dignity. He moved to the Japanese concession in Tianjin. There, he adopted foreign customs, cut his queue, wore glasses, studied science, read newspapers filled with stories of revolutions and republics and rights. But the crown still called to him. In 1932, Japan offered him a throne, of sorts. Not in China, but in Manchukuo, a puppet state carved from the northeast. They called him Emperor again, built him a palace in Changchun, dressed him in dragon robes. But behind every curtain stood Japanese officers. Behind every decree, a translation. He was not ruling. He was performing. He lived in luxury, yes. But he knew it was borrowed. And when the war ended, the lights went out. Captured by the Soviets. Imprisoned. Handed over to the new communist China. And there, in a quiet cell, Hui, the last emperor, was re-educated. He planted flowers. He swept floors. He was taught to say, "I am a citizen of the People's Republic of China." He meant it. Perhaps. He lived out his final years in Beijing as a humble gardener. An ordinary man with an extraordinary past. No palace. No crown. Just chrysanthemums, rain, and routine. In his final days, he was granted a visit to the Forbidden City. As a tourist, he walked through the Meridian Gate, past the Hall of Supreme Harmony, stood in the very place where his throne had once sat. He was old, stooped, dressed in gray. No one bowed. He said nothing. And then he left. And that, dear dreamer, was the last breath of the Qin. A dynasty that spanned 3 centuries, ended not with revolution alone, but with memory. Ashes blown gently across marble floors. Whispers folded into scrolls no longer read. A boy emperor, who became a man without a crown. And a woman, Cixi, who had once held all this in her hand, now a portrait on a museum wall. China moved forward, became something new. But the echoes remain. In the red walls. In the silk robes preserved in glass. In the poems carved into stone beneath peony trees. Empires die, yes. But they do not vanish. They sleep, in the dust of mirrors. And now, dear dreamer, we return once more to her, to the woman behind the throne, to the last dragon of a crumbling age. Cixi. History has called her many things: usurper, tyrant, reformer, mother of modern China. She has been painted in shadows and in light, in outrage and in reverence. But the truth, as ever, lies somewhere softer. She was a girl once. A girl with ink-stained fingers and quiet questions. A daughter of a Manchu scholar, taught to recite poetry while the candles flickered in narrow courtyards. She entered the palace not with ambition, but with hope. She rose not with thunder, but with quiet. She rolled because she had to. She learned because she must. And in doing so, she carved her name into the scroll of time, not gently, not cleanly, but with a blade dipped in ceremony, sorrow, and strength. She made mistakes. She clung to power. She suppressed uprisings. She let some dreams die that others might live. She mistrusted, punished, resisted. But she also opened schools, preserved culture, protected the child emperor when the world grew too loud. She planted plum trees where others might have burned the garden. And she painted. Oh, how she painted. Plum blossoms in snow, cranes in the mist, loneliness shaped in ink. A diary not written in words, but in brushstrokes. Her art was not meant for display, it was her sigh, her silence, her secret voice. Now, her name echoes differently. Modern scholars have returned to her with gentler hands. They read her edicts, her letters, her poems, and they see not a caricature, but a woman navigating an impossible storm. Not a monster, not a saint, a survivor. The forbidden city still stands. It is a museum now, open to the wind. Tourists walk where she once ruled. Children take photos where she once wept. Her portrait hangs in quiet corners. Her robes are folded behind glass. Her inkstone rests beside a fan she once held during long councils of war and weather. And her story? Still unfolding. Each generation retells it. Some add color, some subtract, some write in bitterness, others in awe. But all must begin and end with this truth. She was the last great woman of the old empire, and in her, the dragon's breath flickered one final time before yielding to the modern world. So rest now, dear dreamer. The story has been told. The halls are quiet. The scroll is rolled. Let the candles burn low. Let the garden grow wild. Let her walk again through the pavilion of peonies, fan in hand, eyes forward, toward a tomorrow only she imagined. She is gone, but her shadow still glows. And now, as the stars climb higher and the night deepens its hush, may your thoughts drift gently into sleep. Let the echoes of ancient halls guide your dreams. Let the sigh of silk and the scent of old ink carry you. Rest well, dear dreamer. Until next time.